Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. It's almost evening from where I'm speaking. I'm from Italy. I'm the president of the International Association of Geomorphologists, and on behalf of the executive committee of our association, I would like to welcome you to this third regional webinar of the series of 9 that we are going to hold during the International Week of Geomorphology. There will be some more. There will be one at 1 a.m. Central European time about geomorphology in Southeast Asia and Oceania. So after this, you may want to have another one. There is quite some interesting geomorphology during these days. And not only we have webinars, regional webinars, but we have also a series of side initiatives that are included in the week. And actually, we have an initiative that goes beyond this week and will be held on the 8th of March. And it's a workshop dedicated to the activity of women in geomorphology. So I invite you to join this as well. And it's the second edition of this successful initiative. So I thank the chairs of the webinar for their preparatory work and for the management of this webinar. And I would like also to thank Susan Conway, who worked behind the scenes in organizing all the International Geomorphology Week. And of course, I thank the speakers for their availability to talk today. So have a good webinar and a nice International Geomorphology Week. Thank you very much.
So thank you so much. I really appreciate the invite. I'm intimidated, but also excited to kick off this group of talks. And I'd like to talk today about what marine stratigraphy can tell us about how we should be modeling the evolution of Earth's seascapes or submarine landscapes. This is work I've had the privilege of doing with a really great international group of co-authors that was largely funded by a Marie Curie fellowship. So when we as geomorphologists take a look at Earth's surface, we see a lot of interesting stuff, right? Maybe you see your favorite field site, maybe you're a Himalayas person or an Appalachians person, but there's also a lot that we don't see. For example, every mountain range that's ever come and gone, except for the ones that are kind of still around and kicking, we don't have too much of a record of, right? And that, causes us no end of trouble. It's very difficult when erosion removes all traces of past landscapes to go back and say much about what Earth's surface used to look like, how it used to work, maybe when there were tectonic or climatic perturbations that affected surface processes. And so we're always on the hunt for ways to improve the body of evidence, right? Beyond maybe a few shreds of river terraces or alluvial fan surfaces or things like that. So certainly I wouldn't be the first to say, well, okay, let's see. To say that we want to find some improved ways to basically know the evolution trajectories of landscapes that are long gone, right? How can we get at past landscape dynamics, paleoclimate, tectonic perturbations, if most of the terrestrial evidence of that landscape evolution is gone? And this question has led people to do a really smart thing, which is to sort of look at the depositional end of erosive systems, right? So the Earth is largely composed of source to sink systems where most sediment grains eroded on continents end up somewhere in the ocean, forming this beautiful halo of thick sedimentary deposits around most of Earth's continents. And we especially see this on passive continental margins, for example, ringing the Atlantic Ocean here in this image. And so, there have been a variety of ways that people have said that they want to kind of interrogate these deposits to know something about what's gone on the continents. We might, for example, drill a really deep hole into these sedimentary packages and ask some questions about whatever we pull out of that. We might shoot some seismic and ask questions about what that seismic is telling us about what happened in the past on continents. But the thread of this research that interests me the most and has really accelerated in the past 5 to 10 years is the idea that we might be able to use computational landscape evolution models, or landscape and seascape evolution models, to invert this stratigraphic record. And that's really been enabled by recent advances in the speed and scale of landscape evolution models. And the idea basically is that we might take some computational model that can do erosion on the land surface, sediment transport, and then deposition in some marine basin like I'm showing here. And we might use that model to build a synthetic stratigraphy. That's in fact happening as we speak. This model's piling up sediment in a basin, and there is arising from that some stratigraphic record. We can then take that stratigraphic record, compare it against some data that we have, for example, seismic stratigraphy, and then ask what that can tell us about past terrestrial landscape evolution. So if we sort of put this workflow into words, the idea might be that we run many, many model simulations with different values of, say, a rock uplift rate or some climate parameter or some rock erodibility function, compare the results of those simulations to observed stratigraphy, and ideally make some inference about what used to be going on at Earth's surface. Maybe there was some pulse of rock uplift we can pin down or something like this. And this has been used to great effect over the past decade or so by a variety of different groups doing really exciting work. And I think they would agree with the statement that these inverse approaches, these source to sink or sink to source, if you will, inversion approaches are great, but they're only as good as the model that sort of lives in that box, right? If we have some fundamental mathematical misconception of how sediment transport processes stack up over space and time, then the inferences we make from these inverse analyses may not be as good as we would like them to be. So the question I'm going to focus on today is how good are our current seascape evolution models, which have received a lot less attention than their sort of terrestrial counterparts, at simulating the development of stratigraphy over basically basin development timescales. So think 100 million years. And I'm going to sort of ask rhetorically and then answer this question: can they then be improved? Is there some way we can improve our representation of geologic scale marine seascape evolution processes? So the current approach that sort of gets the most play in marine sediment transport modeling over large timescales is done by making analogy to the heat equation, right? It's this local linear diffusion approach that's so often used in terrestrial landscapes, where we're thinking about the diffusion of elevation, basically, or this idea that some topographic surface changes over time as a result of the imbalance between the flux of sediment into versus out of some control volume, or your little box, right? So you have your little box of sediment, and if more goes out than comes in, your land surface lowers, or your sea surface, and vice versa. And we then typically close this, or people typically close this by saying that, well, what controls this downslope sediment flux? Well, it probably goes linearly with the local slope. So the sediment flux from any point is dependent simply on one parameter that we tend to call K, doesn't matter, and the local bathymetric slope. It scales linearly with that quantity. And this approach has been used to great effect over and over and over again by folks looking to simulate the development of marine stratigraphy. And in fact, the simulation that I showed you earlier is operating using these rules. Those little deltas you see being built, those kind of steep fronted deposits prograding into the basin, are operating under that sort of paradigm. And I think it's fair, and I wouldn't be the first person to point it out, to say that though this is really useful, it's computationally tractable, it's parsimonious, it's simple, there are some potential limitations to this approach that I think we can just sort of qualitatively discuss by looking at some marine basin stratigraphy. So here I'm showing you a 800-kilometer long, beautiful seismic section interpreted by Guillaume Babi and colleagues from the Orange Basin in Southern Africa, meaning basically that the right-hand side of the screen is the mouth of the Orange River, give or take, and the left-hand side of the screen is the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. And the thing I really want to point out here is that we see deposition of significant thicknesses of sediment way, way out into the ocean, right? We don't see some sort of steep delta front that kind of ends a couple of 100 kilometers out. We see a lot of long distance sediment transport with substantial accumulations, even 500 or 600 kilometers out into the basin. And that leads us to the conclusion, sort of inescapable, that sediment must be somehow bypassing these steep slopes on, for example, the continental slope, and then moving over slopes that we would consider vanishingly small, sort of near zero slopes, resulting in the ability to accumulate substantial piles of sediment far out into the basin. And I think sort of field and experimental evidence shows us that this is likely due to a class of what we might call non-local transport dynamics, or the idea that maybe our sediment flux isn't just a function of slope at a given point. Maybe it's a function of all the slopes that a sediment grain has seen on its journey towards a basin floor. So the way I like to sort of drive that point home is by thinking about a ski jump, right? On a ski jump, you sort of start out at the top of this track, right? And you gain a lot of momentum as you start skiing down this incredibly steep and terrifying hill. And just because the hill flattens out a little bit towards the bottom, you don't come to a halt and deposit right there. You just keep flying right through because you've got so much momentum, right? And this to me is sort of emblematic of a continental slope basin floor system where I think there's a lot of really great evidence by Peter Tolling and colleagues, among others, that what we often see is substantial sediment and mass movements like marine debris flows and turbidity currents, gaining a lot of momentum and training a lot of sediment and water on the steeper parts of the continental slope, bypassing those portions of the margin, and then being able to travel at least hundreds of kilometers out over near zero slopes onto the basin floor. So the question I want to sort of pose today, colloquially, is how do we make our models more like a ski jump? And I think the way to do that simply is sort of with two key small tweaks that are not, my ideas alone, but I would say we sort of derive from different points made by the community over the past few years. So sort of change one is this idea that only some proportion of sediment should be deposited even when you're traveling over a zero slope, right? You've got to have some ability to transport sediment over these negligible slopes. And second, this idea that sediment bypass or a lack of deposition should occur as your bathymetric slope becomes steeper. Now, I'm not going to go into the math on this, but there should be a preprint coming soon that you can dive into on that if you're interested. So when we code up these tweaks to that local linear diffusion approach, we can come up with some basin model where we pipe sediment in from the right-hand side, we evolve it according to this set of rules, and we can then build a passive margin sediment accumulation that looks like something we might expect to see. So what I'd like to do for the next few minutes here is to do a sort of model data comparison exercise where we find the best fit model given some data set for both the sort of local linear existing approach and this tweaked approach we've proposed, and then ask the question, which one represents observed stratigraphy better? So that would sort of give us a null hypothesis that would say, well, if our changed or sort of non-local transport model doesn't improve model data fit, we would then say that, well, maybe these long distance slope dependent processes or slope bypass processes don't have that big of an influence on marine stratigraphy, and we don't need to think too much about them when we're doing these inverse exercises. I'm going to argue that that is not right, and that the alternative hypothesis is true, which is that these non-local transport processes are really important in yielding an improved model fit to stratigraphic data, and therefore that these long distance transport and slope bypass processes govern margin dynamics are an important part of the picture when we're doing these stratigraphic inversion exercises. So the test case we're going to use here, again, is off the southern African margin, so basically the western coast of South Africa and Namibia, where there's been a lot of really beautiful seismic interpretation done by Guillaume Babi and colleagues. So what we have from this site is we have 7 really nice long shore perpendicular seismic sections showing us all about how sediment has accumulated in this area over the past 130 million years or so. I'm only going to show you in detail our analysis of one of those sections, but rest assured, we have done it for all 7. When we run our kind of canonical local transport model and allow it to achieve a best fit with one of these seismic sections, we actually find that it can't really do a very good job. So what we're showing here is the kind of pastel polygons are observed stratigraphy as interpreted by Guillaume and others. And then the black lines are showing our modeled seismic reflectors. So our modeled surfaces, paleo surfaces or subsurface reflectors are in the black dashed lines, and the modeled modern bathymetric surface is in black. And what we see here is that we kind of miss the continental shelf, continental slope rollover. It's too sharp. We don't really get it in the right location. And we're not able to transport sediment far out enough into the basin to really match what we're observing. And that's shown here by this misfit plot where I break out spatially this non-dimensional misfit metric where high misfits are bad. And we certainly achieve high misfit over towards the distal end of this plot. When we add in these non-local transport dynamics, with the ability to bypass steep slopes and move sediment over low slopes, we end up with a much better fit, where not only do we get that sort of continental shelf, continental slope transition in the right place and with the right shape, but we're also able to move sediment farther out into the basin in a way that fits a little bit more with how the seismic shows us things happened in the orange basin. And I've only shown you one section here for time purposes, but I can assure you that we did this 7 separate times. And indeed, 6 out of 7 times our non-local or our modified approach yields much, much lower misfit between model and data when simulating this stratigraphy. So this is a plot of model data misfit for both approaches for the 7 seismic sections we looked at. And only in one case does that modified model not do a better job. And I will say that that's a case where neither model does a good job at all. Not sure why that is. But for 6 of these 7 cases, we see significant improvement driven by the fact that we're incorporating these non-local sediment bypass and long distance transport processes. I want to make one more point before I wrap up about kind of the dynamics of these 2 models and how they might compare to one another. So you've seen both of these sections before. I'm showing the results of our sort of classic local linear model, as well as this modified approach we've put together. And one point I want to make is that in this local linear diffusion approach, we see really classic diffusion-like behavior, which is sort of the progradation of this steep-fronted sediment wedge out into the basin over time. And you can see that in the black dashed lines representing our simulated subsurface seismic reflectors. That just simply doesn't fit with what the stratigraphy is telling us about how these layers were laid down over time. What we actually observe is much closer to the results of our lower plot here, our non-local transport model, where we're actually just draping successive sediment layers, one on top of the other, each to a very great distance out into the basin, with very little truncation of underlying layers as new ones are deposited. And so I think we can kind of rule out the local linear approach in favor of this non-local transport model because, or sort of on both dynamical grounds and on the grounds that it produces stratigraphy much closer to what we observe through time. So I'll leave it there. I want to leave you with three ideas. The first is that incorporating these long distance or non-local transport processes significantly improves predictions for stratigraphy. That indicates to us, or I would argue, that these slope bypass and long distance transport processes are important in shaping the stratigraphic record, and that incorporating those processes into models should improve our ability to invert for landscape evolution history from stratigraphy. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you again for tuning in today and for inviting me to participate in this event. First, a little bit about me. I'm Dr. Frances Rivera-Hernandez, and I'm an assistant professor at Georgia Tech, which is a university in Atlanta, Georgia. And most of my research focuses on studying sedimentary rocks and terrains, and so landscapes, to better characterize ancient and modern environments on planetary bodies, mainly Earth and Mars. And I do this to obtain information about their climate and also water availability and distribution, and to determine if these environments, in particular water environments, have or had conditions habitable for life. And so my research is interdisciplinary. I commonly combine remote sensing, numerical analyses, and field studies, mainly in polar regions. And so here on the left, for example, is a picture of me studying deltas and lake bottom sediments in a frozen lake in Antarctica back in 2015. And on the right is a picture of the Curiosity rover, a mission that I'm involved with. And so I do a lot of work with rover images as well. But as Marissa mentioned, I'll be talking about mostly deltaic deposits today on Mars. Outside of research, I'm also heavily involved in multiple organizations that are helping to increase the representation of Latinx in the geosciences, but also providing a support and mentoring network for us. And so these include SOLES, which is the Society of Latinx Hispanic Earth and Space Scientists, Geolatinas, which is an international group of Latina geoscientists, and maybe some of you have heard of Geolatinas. We're quite active on Twitter. And then also the Boricua Planeteers, which is a group of Puerto Rican space and planetary scientists. And I myself am a Latina from Puerto Rico. And so, yeah, so all of these organizations have an online presence. And so if you're interested in joining, or if you know somebody who's interested in joining, feel free to send me an email or come and check out our websites. We have Twitter accounts, Facebook, Instagram, websites. And so if you are interested in learning more, and we're also looking for allies, definitely check that out. All right, enough about me. Today, as the title suggests, I'll be talking about whether deltaic deposits on Mars record an ancient northern ocean. And you might be wondering why we even care whether Mars had a northern ocean. And it really comes down to the fact that we don't have a consensus for what the climate of early Mars was like and how much liquid water could have been present. What we do know is that the climate must have been different, because currently liquid water is not stable on the surface of Mars, but there's abundant geologic evidence for the presence of liquid water in the past. And while we don't have a consensus, we do have two leading scenarios for what the climate was like. The first is called the cold and icy Mars scenario, where Mars was cold, where the water was predominantly in ice form, and maybe a couple of days a year, temperatures went above freezing to periodically melt ice, forming liquid water to produce rivers and lakes. In the other model, Mars would have been warm with abundant liquid water in its surface, much like Earth is today. And so in that scenario, Mars could have been able to sustain rivers and lakes and possibly an ocean. And again, it would have been a little bit more Earth-like. And so if we do have evidence for a past ocean, then that tells us that at least for some period of time, Mars had higher surface pressures and also a climate that would have been warm enough to sustain liquid water on its surface. And also that it had enough water to fill the northern part of Mars, and so that basin. And so we also would be able to get estimates of water budgets. And so this would essentially help support the warm and wet Mars scenario. Through, in the last several decades, there have been several pieces of evidence that have been used to suggest the presence of an ocean on Mars. For my talk today, I'm just going to focus on deltaic deposits, as they are currently one of the strongest pieces of evidence that we have that Mars had an ocean. All right, so this is an example of a deltaic deposit on Mars. And so this is an actual orbital image that was taken of this delta or deltaic deposit. And so what we see is that there's this beautiful deltaic deposit with this arcuate shape, and that's characteristic of Gilbert type deltas, and that it emerges from this incised valley here that we interpret to be the Paleo channel. And so, as I mentioned, there's this beautiful arcuate shape, and then the stipply dipping front, which is characteristic of deltas. And on Earth, deltas form in standing bodies of water, generally in lakes and oceans. And so here on the left are examples of deltas that are forming in a lake in the Tibetan Plateau. And then on the right, deltas that are a delta that's forming in an ocean setting in Greenland. And in both examples, we can see that the deltas have that arcuate shape. And here on the right, we also even see that incised valley where the channel is coming in. And so back to Mars, the paleohydrology of the bodies of water in which the deltas form can actually be reconstructed by using the elevation of the front of the deltas. And so these are proxies for paleo water level. And so essentially this is where that stable water level would have been when the delta formed. And so for this case, for this deltaic deposit here, the elevation of that delta front, again, would have represents the stable water level for when that delta formed. And so using these very basic concepts, a previous global delta study of Mars interpreted that deltas that fall along the dichotomy boundary of Mars formed in the Northern Ocean. And the dichotomy boundary is probably one of the most striking features of the red planet. It's essentially the boundary where we see a drastic change from the north to the south part of Mars. And so we can kind of see that here in this global map of Mars. This is a topographic map of Mars. And the dichotomy boundary is about where that pink line is here, where again, we see that the northern part of Mars is considerably lower and smoother than the southern part of Mars, which is at a higher elevation and also has rougher topography. And so the deltaic deposits from that previous study, as I mentioned, fall along that dichotomy boundary. And the elevation of their delta fronts were used to interpret that they formed in the same standing body of water, and that water water body was an ancient ocean that had a paleo water level equivalent to this purple line here. The highest concentration of these deltas occurs here in a region that we call here the Gale Crater region. While these deltas are distributed throughout Mars, their highest concentration is in this region. And so this is a close-up view of that Gale Crater region, where we see the deltas are abundant, and the deltas here are marked by the little diamonds. And Gale Crater is right smack in the middle of this, and right smack in the middle of the dichotomy boundary. And Gale Crater is of interest to us because it's the home of the Curiosity rover, and with Curiosity, we do have evidence for aqueous environments in the sedimentary rocks. And so, in general, for Martians, we're kind of interested in what happens in Gale Crater and in the surrounding region which is also why we kind of focused on this part. One of the interesting things in Gale Crater is that it actually doesn't have any geomorphic evidence that it was ever part of a northern ocean. Instead, data suggests that deltas inside of Gale Crater likely formed in lakes. And this is actually PhD work that Marissa Palusis did. And so we see here on the left, this is a black and white orbital image of Gale Crater, showing the location of these deltas here in the stars. And the front of those deltas were used to reconstruct 3 different lake stands inside of Gale Crater. And so, and then an example of one of these deltas is shown here on the right, which is the beautiful Pancake Delta. And so, so with this, you know, we kind of go back to this question, you know, is it actually true? You know, if it's the case that some of the deltas that were part of that original study, that interpreted them to form in an ocean, and instead they actually formed in these lakes, at least for Gale Crater, then we start to question whether some of the other deltas, other dichotomy deltas, also formed in a global ocean. And this actually might have huge implications. As I mentioned, the Gale Crater region has the highest concentration of these dichotomy deltas, and deltas have been one of the strongest pieces of evidence that we have for a northern ocean on Mars. And so with that, today I'm going to be addressing this question: do deltas in the Gale Crater region record a northern ocean? And again, we're focusing on the Gale Crater region as it does have the highest concentration of these deltas, but we do want to expand our analyses to other regions. And there's actually work that Dr. Palusis just got funded to do. And so while we are interested in other regions, today I'm just going to be focusing on the Gale Crater region. All right, so to address this question, I analyzed new and previously identified deltas with updated imagery and derived topography. For my inventory, landforms were classified as deltas or fans. Deltas were identified by their arcuate forms and low gradient tops and stiffly dipping fronts, as shown here on the bottom left. This is another example of a deltaic deposit in the Gale Crater region. And if we took a profile through that landform, we would see the profile here on the right, where again, we have that low gradient top and stiffly dipping front, where the delta front again is a proxy for paleo water level. And this is in contrast to the other landform type that we were able to document, which are fans. And these are distinguished from deltas as they tend to have concave up to linear long profiles. And so if we took a profile of this fan here on the right from B to B prime, we would see that its sort of profile shape, which is quite distinct from the deposits that we interpret to be deltas. And of course, in addition to the physical differences between these types of landforms, they also record different depositional environments. Deltas form, of course, subaquously, whereas fans form subaerially. All right, so with that in mind, zooming in back into the Gale Crater region, this is a topographic map where the diamonds here are the location of deltas from that previous study that I was talking about. And on top of that, I'm going to add my new delta inventory, which is shown here with the white diamonds and the white triangles. And one of the things that immediately pops out is the high number of deltas in this region. It's just littered with them, but that they also occur in clusters. And so, for example, there's a cluster here and a cluster here, if you can see my arrow. But this is actually easier to visualize if we move this to a plot form. And so here I have plotted delta front elevation on the y-axis and longitude in the x-axis. And each dot here is the delta front elevation for one of those deltas. And again, one of the things that we do see is that regionally, these deltas are clustered in groups, and that deltas that are near each other tend to have similar delta front elevations and thus paleo water levels. And some of these groups are highlighted here in these circles. And just to give you a sense for how that is different from that paleo water level interpretation for the possible ocean, we have this line here in blue. And so the concentration of deltas with similar delta front elevations suggests that, that deltas within those groups formed in the same standing body of water. And so by averaging their delta front elevations, we were able to use them as water level proxies for their basins. And so with that, we found that there's evidence for 10 paleo lakes in the Gale Crater region, 4 of which host multiple deltas. The largest paleo lake would have been a little smaller than Lake Ontario. And together, these 4 lakes would have been able to store 5 centimeters of global water equivalent, which is the water depth if it were spread out equally on Mars, which is actually not a lot. Previous estimates for the inferred Northern Ocean is 550 meters global water equivalent, which is, again, quite drastic when we're thinking about what the water budgets were like on early Mars and also what the climate was like. And so we can start thinking about implications again for Mars's history. The presence of these lakes are also supported by initial geomorphic analyses. And so this is work that Melanie Canine, a former undergraduate at Dartmouth and current grad student at Caltech, worked on. She observed that she did some work on one of the basins. And what she saw was that the basin tends to have smoother textures compared to the surrounding topography. And that there's also possible shoreline features along the perimeter of the basin, kind of highlighted here on the right. And by using these characteristics, Melanie was able to independently map one of these basins, again, helping support our interpretation that these lakes are lake basins. And so going back to this question, do delta deposits or deltaic deposits in the Gale Crater region record a Northern Ocean? Short answer is no. It looks like the deltas likely formed in paleo lakes. And so what are the implications of this for the Northern Ocean hypothesis? Well, we can't rule out the Northern Ocean hypothesis because there are other features that may have formed in an ocean. These include other surface flow features called valley networks that terminate along the dichotomy boundary. And these are highlighted here on the left, just a section of the dichotomy boundary, and the valley networks are marked here in red. There are also previous studies that have mapped features that are interpreted to be paleo shorelines, although recently higher resolution data have shown that these do not represent equipotential surfaces, and that we actually don't even really know where these features are or where they're actually located due to inconsistent mapping between publications of the same map level, which is shown here on the right. And so each line here is the different map levels of those shorelines from different papers. And again, these are just inconsistent between the different papers. And so while there are other features that suggest the presence of the Northern Ocean, a lot of that is also have been called, a lot of those pieces of evidence have also been called into question. More recently, apart from the valley networks and paleo shorelines, there are also other dichotomy deltas. Again, our study just focused on the Gale Crater region. However, there have been more recent studies that have looked at some of the other dichotomy deltas. One of these papers just came out last week by Joel Davis et al. 2022, where they also interpreted that some of the deltas along the dichotomy formed in paleo lakes and not a Northern Ocean. And so this is actually where a lot of our attention is being focused right now, is to do detailed geomorphic analyses on some of these other deltas. As I mentioned, Dr. Marissa Palusas at Dartmouth just got a grant funded last year to do some of this work that I'm also involved with. It's also possible that these lakes in the Gale Crater region are remnants of an ocean, and so maybe they represent a later waning stage. And so essentially, you would have an ocean, and that ocean dried up through time to then have these different lake basins. However, we do not see any geomorphic evidence for that in the deltas. If there was an ocean and the ocean was drying down, the elevation of the fronts of the deltas would actually be tracking that elevation change, and we just don't see that. We don't see any progradation in the deltas due to a water level drop. That we just don't see that in any of the deltaic deposits. However, some of the deltas are overlain by alluvial fans, and so in some cases we have the deltas, and right on top of that we have evidence for alluvial fans. And so maybe this suggests a change in water availability from wet to dry conditions, or possibly a reactivation of the catchment. And so because I'm down to time, I did want to end with saying that another one of these deltas is in Jezero Crater, which is the current home of the Perseverance rover. And that delta is also interpreted to be a lake. And hopefully with Perseverance rover images, we're going to be able to get a better understanding of the water history for that deltaic deposit. All right, thank you so much again for inviting me, and I'll take any questions if we have time. Thanks.
So thank you also for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here this morning with you guys. I'll be presenting a portion of my research work for my dissertation, and it's going to be bringing you back to Earth and relating how nearshore bar morphologies affect the morphology of beach and dune systems, especially after storm events. And a little bit of a summary of what are we going to be talking about today. I just want to talk a little bit about the motivations of why I decided to do this kind of work, and give you some background information on how nearshore bars used to look like, or not used to look like, how studies used to portray them. And then get into this portion of the study, and then give you a summary of why this kind of research is important. It's sort of combining both the geomorphology aspects of coastal dynamics and coastal geomorphology with the management aspects of coastal management and ecosystem services. So in the coastal geomorphology world, we know that the bar morphology, the different types of bars that we have and observe in the near shore, affect and influence how the beach and dune are gonna change over time. If they're gonna create it, they're gonna erode, and sort of act as a reservoir of sand for the beach and dune system in terms of when storms come in, it protects them from the storm energy. But studies usually separate the systems and study the coast and the beach together. So, the dunes and the beach together as one system. And although they recognize that the nearshore bars have something to do with the influences, there's no holistic study, or there was no holistic study that looked at the three systems together and tried to conceptualize how one affected the other, especially during storm conditions. So the main objectives of the study was, one, to be able to measure the bar morphology using multispectral imagery, which is something that started to be done recently, hadn't been done before. It's usually using either in situ instrumentation or having CCTV cameras, which I'm going to show you a little bit later how they look like. But very few studies were done using multispectral imagery. So that was our first goal for this project. Then we wanted to establish if those coastal system components, so the beach, the dune, and the nearshore bars, and how they vary geographically. So do we observe these changes happening over time on the same spaces, or are there unique dynamics or patterns relating to how these systems change, specifically again during storms? And then lastly, we wanted to quantify those changes. So how did the bar morphology change the characteristics or influence the characteristics of the coastal system and the conditions that it received during storm conditions? And the end goal, again, it was almost twofold. One was to understand for coastal management how the bar morphology affected the coastal dynamics, but also try to reduce the cost of analysis and monitoring of beach systems that in situ projects bring with them. And I'm going to be, when I show you the example of the CCTV cameras, the Argus system, I'm going to talk a little bit about the cost and the limitations of having in situ instrumentation at the beach. But a little bit of background of why I decided to do this work. Back in 2012, I had the opportunity to do my master's at East Carolina and to participate in an NSF-funded project to study specifically dunes in the Province Land region of Cape Cod as part of the Cape Cod National Seashore, which you're looking at a portion of it here on your screens. And I was interested because when we were there, the shoreline of Cape Cod varies a lot. As you can see in this image, it goes from places that it's really wide to places that it's really narrow. And so does the dune line. The dune line is going to be very well developed in some regions, specifically right here on this northern portion, and is going to be highly eroded with scarps in these regions. And I noticed that besides those changes in the actual shoreline of having a wider shoreline or a narrower shoreline, Cape Cod exhibit a well-established multi-bar system. And you guys can see it here in this image and very clear. This is a Google Earth image, but you can see them very clear. Cape Cod has a permanent bar right here, sandbar. It's called a Peak Heel bar, which is remnant of the glacial period when Cape Cod was actually formed geomorphologically. And then it also has in between the shoreline and that permanent bar, it has a multi-bar system with longshore bars, some crescentic bars, which are the ones that look like Cs. And then it has portions with those transverse bars that are perpendicular to the beach. And I wanted to know and be able to understand if the fact that this area had so many different types of bars was affecting the way that the shoreline dynamics occur for the beach and for the dunes. But I found that it was really difficult to get that information, again, because usually the systems are studied separately. So there's a lot of studies regarding the bar system there and a lot of studies regarding the dune system there, including the one that I was working on at the time. But there wasn't one that looked at all three components together. So when I got the opportunity to do my PhD work, I decided to look into this. Now, I was restricted into the locations that I could do or use because I needed to validate my information. So if I wanted to obtain my bar morphology data from multispectral imagery, I needed to validate the data that I had. So unfortunately, I couldn't do my PhD work in Cape Cod, but I found 3 locations across, it was supposed to be across the US, but I'll explain the third one in a minute, across the US where I could both study the nearshore bars and be able to develop that component of the nearshore bar system and study it using multispectral imagery and validate it, which was the most important part, and then look at the systems and how it changed with storm dynamics. So we decided to use 3 study sites that reflected the different beach types in the US. So having an Atlantic beach with Doug, North Carolina, have a Gulf Coast beach with Bay St. Louis in Mississippi. And we wanted one in the West Coast, but the problem with the West Coast is that the bar systems there are too deep and you can't see them with multispectral imagery. So I decided to use a location in Casino Beach in Rio Grande do Sul, Brazil, because it has similar conditions to what we can find on the West Coast of the US. So that was our third site. And here we have intermediate and dissipative beaches, which vary in slope from going from very flat slopes at the beach to a little bit more inclined, because those are going to be the beaches that are going to exhibit bar formations. We didn't have any reflective beaches, because reflective beaches have a very high slope, and beaches that have that high slope usually don't have nearshore bars associated with them. And you can sort of see here the bars based on the where the wave breaks. Doug, North Carolina has a single bar system, but it's a rhythmic bar system, so it moves and fluctuates through time. Bay St. Louis has a well-developed multi-bar system that is very beautiful, and you can see clear in the image. And then Casino Beach has 1 to 2 bars that appear in certain times of the year, specifically when they have stormy conditions. But again, one of the main reasons why we picked this site is because it has the Argus system. And the Argus system is going to be the CCTV camera system. It's a tower that it's put on the beach where you can obtain and monitor data. And this is what's been used since the late 1980s to monitor and study nearshore bars in coastal areas. And it produces three types of data. You get video monitoring, so that's why we call it a CCTV camera, because it's recording constantly. You can do time average data, where based on where the waves are breaking, you can estimate the position of the bar. And you can also use a product that is called Timex, which is also a time variance data, also to look at the changes of the bars through time. But the problem with this system is that it's very expensive to keep and maintain, and there are also problems with weather, related to weather. Some of them are destroyed by hurricanes, like the one that was in Bay St. Louis. Others get hit by lightning and they stop working. And because they're so expensive, we need other ways that are better and more accessible to study bar systems. So there's people use surf cams, which are readily available in many places. It's the cameras that surfers use to know how the weather looks like so they can go surf. We can use aerial photography, and in my case, I wanted to use multispectral imagery. So that's sort of the background of where everything started. So a little bit of the summary of the methods that we use. We first had to obtain that meteorological and climatological data in order to establish those pre and post storm conditions. Then we did the multispectral image analysis using object-based classification. And then we validated that data as well to be able to know that we were actually looking at the bars. And I'm not going to cover that for lack of time, but if you have any questions at the end, I can send you information about it. But we validated that data with the Argus imagery, which is why we picked those three sites. We characterized all three sites and then went to analyze the system-wide responses to storm conditions by looking at the characteristics of the beach, dune, and bar system, pre-storm and post-storm. And then we compare the results for all three sites. And again, this is to come up with a conceptual analysis of how the morphology is going to affect those systems. And we did that by identifying areas where we observe erosion or accretion. And we identify specific characteristics of those bars in relation to the recovery rate of the beach and dune system. And this is a lot of information in this graph, but this is like a summary of how we calculated all that information for the pre and post-storm conditions. So we knew what the significant wave heights were for the three beaches at location. And then what we did, based on previous studies, we calculated the storm conditions or times when the significant wave height was exceeded at each location for at least 6 hours. And this is what you're seeing here. And then based on those, we identified those periods, and then we obtained imagery from pre and post those storms. We also calculated wave energy right here at the on the very right, because it helped us understand or compare the three sites, because these three sites are very different. So it helped us understand and compare the energy that these sites received during the storm conditions and what observations we saw. Now, really quickly, I'm going to show you just a summary of how these systems look like. So this is a pre-storm condition. And you can see that I superimposed some arrows where the bar is. You can sort of see where the bar is located based on where the waves is breaking, but you can see that there's some spaces where there's some breakage, and that means that there's a longshore bar there, but it's discontinuous. So there's spaces where the waves are not being attenuated. So the energy of the waves is reaching the coastline. And you can see how those corresponds to hotspots in the dune line, specifically where you have erosion in the dune line. So here we can observe two. You have one right here, left of the pier, and one right here, right of the pier, where the dune line is receding. So we ran all our analysis, and what we saw and observed, and this is a post-storm image. This is again the location where those gaps in the previous image were located and where the bar was identified to have gaps. And we observed that where those gaps are, you can see the dune line again eroding. This is the one, oops, the one that we originally saw, but then another hotspot forming next to it, again, because the wave energy was strong enough to reach and erode that condition. We see how narrow the beach is in this location where the second bar is located. The second gap is located, and also the recedings of the dune line again. And we have a third hotspot that opened up after the storm that wasn't there before, where the third gap was located. And again, this is just an example of some of the information that we recapitulated among all the events that we observed at 3 sites. But with that information, and the most important thing that we found from this space was that we were able to create a conceptual model to see how the bars are going to affect the region. And to summarize really quickly, when we have longshore bars, continuous longshore bars, those are going to be the ones that are going to act like those reservoirs of sand that are going to protect the beach and the dune system, because they're going to attenuate the wave energy as it comes to the beach and help it reduce that energy that they're receiving, and therefore reducing erosion. While we have those discontinuous bars, they're going to have those periods of erosion, of protection, but then there's going to have areas of erosion where the energy is going to come through and attack the dune line, attack the beach, and cause significant erosion. With the crescentic bars, which we observe in Bay St. Louis, it's more interesting because they're going to protect the beach as well, because they're going to serve as attenuation. But then you're going to have areas where you're going to have that they're going to be too close to the shoreline. And even though in the beach, and this is called the horn of the crescentic bar, they're going to create this cusp where the beach is going to be wider. Because they're so close, the waves are going to push in and they're going to be attenuated, but they're still going to carry a lot of energy that are going to erode or help erode the dune line specifically. If they're attached to the shoreline, which in Bay St. Louis, we saw some of them that were attached to the shoreline, this effect of attenuation is barely negligible, and it's going to cause a lot of erosion in the region. We didn't observe particularly transverse bars, so that's something that we're studying in the future of how those look like. But again, to summarize, the reason why we did this is because understanding this relationship between the bar, the beaches, and the dunes, and how the variation of the bar shapes influence the beach and dune characteristic, it's important to be able to protect the beach ecosystem services and to be able to do better coastal management of where to allocate resources. Because if you know that there's a gap in your bar system, you can allocate funds to protect a certain area, especially for communities in coastal communities that live really close to the water, and protect them from erosion. And again, be better at managing your resources as well. So that was the end goal of doing this kind of study. And with that, I just want to acknowledge the funding sources, the AAG, the Southern Regional Board of Education, and the Department of South Carolina of Geography for helping me finance some portions of this study. And with that, I think I'm right on time, so I don't know if there's time for questions, but my email is there if you guys need me. I might have to present and dash as well because I have to teach in 5 minutes, but I'm here if we can get a question or two on the board.
I'm Katherine Lininger. I'm an assistant professor at University of Colorado Boulder in the Department of Geography. My work looks at ecogeomorphic processes. I look at how river processes influence where carbon is stored, but also wood interactions in river corridors with geomorphology. So today I want to talk about a particular project that is led by Jeff Falk, who's a fish ecologist at the University of Alaska Fairbanks. This project looks at logjam patterns, wood recruitment, and salmon habitat in a subarctic boreal river system. And I'd also like to acknowledge my other co-authors who are part of management agencies in interior Alaska. So when we talk about wood in rivers, log jams, or accumulations of wood, one of which you can see here in your upper right, they have a lot of ecogeomorphic impacts in river systems. So they modify hydraulics and sediment transport, They influence bed form development and planform dynamics. And they also create and maintain physical complexity, so the physical template of river systems and the diversity of that template. So along with, you could consider the natural flow regime in rivers, incoming water, incoming sediment, the natural sediment regime in rivers. You can think about wood as really a structuring agent in river systems and in rivers and floodplains. So along with these physical effects, they also, with log jams or accumulations of wood, also influence fish habitat. So they provide cover for fish, they provide flow refugia, they influence primary production by providing substrate for periphyton, they increase invertebrate biomass or water insects, the biomass of those insects that fish eat. And so they're really important both geomorphically and for fish. However, most studies of wood are relatively limited in spatial extent and in ecogeomorphic linkages. So as part of a meta-analysis study a few years ago now, looking at wood loads across different bioclimatic regions, and here we have wood load on the y-axis and drainage area on the x-axis, and most studies of wood have been in headwater streams. And so there's fewer studies in larger river systems and also across entire river networks, which sort of limits our understanding of wood processes in bigger river systems. But boreal or subarctic river networks provide an opportunity to investigate wood dynamics in these larger systems, in part because temperate regions or the US and European areas where wood has been studied a lot, larger systems in those areas have been really highly impacted and modified by humans. So although there are human impacts in boreal systems, and the one that I'll talk about today as well, really we have an opportunity in the high latitudes to look at wood processes in bigger systems. And these ecogeomorphic linkages are really important. So log jams are important fish habitats, but studies have not necessarily integrated variation in log jam formation and habitat use across an entire river network. They've been sort of more local scale. So with this project that I'm a part of, we are looking at spatial patterns of log jams and use by juvenile Chinook salmon in the Chena River system, which is part of the Yukon River Basin. And our project questions include things like, how does log jam frequency vary with geomorphic characteristics across the river network? What are the patterns in juvenile Chinook salmon use of log jams across this network? And how have human impacts, in particular, a dam that was built on the Chena upstream of Fairbanks, which is at the outlet of the Chena River, how has that influenced log jam formation potential? And then at the end of this talk, I'd just like to sort of zoom out a little and talk a bit about future work on log jam influences on channel floodplain dynamics that I'm hoping to work on in the high latitudes in the boreal regions. So a motivating factor for this research is Yukon River Chinook salmon decline. All species or multiple types of salmon have declined in the Yukon River Basin, so have Chinook salmon. And here you can see a schematic of their life cycle. They move from the ocean up into freshwater to spawn. And then they do spend about over a year as juveniles in freshwater networks. And a lot of the decline has been linked to oceanic processes, but there isn't as much known about this life stage of juvenile Chinook salmon that are sort of existing in these freshwater systems. And so that's why things like log jams become really important. This is a picture of a log jam on the Chena. So log jams take many forms. They can be channel margin or floodplain margin deposits, deposits on bars, for example, and they can get up to, for example, multiple hundreds of meters long along a river system. So this is a picture of the Christian River that flows into the Yukon in interior Alaska, and you can see these large log rafts modifying this river and being stuck in the sinuous stretches. So as I said, the study area is the Chena River in Alaska. This is Fairbanks, Alaska, in the interior Alaska. And for the purposes of this study, we've divided the drainage in 2 different sections: headwaters, the middle fork, south fork, the middle main stem, and the lower main stem. This star shows the Moose Creek Dam, which is the dam that was built in the 1980s on the Chena that I'll talk about later. And the black outline along this network is the known distribution of Chinook salmon. So there's a surprising variety in habitats here for Chinook salmon. But just to give you a sense of what these sort of sections look like, the headwaters and the middle fork, they have smaller drainage areas. They're more confined laterally, so the valley is more narrow relative to the channel, but they also tend to have multiple branches, a lot of exposed bars. I would call these wandering gravel bed rivers that are gravel bedded and relatively laterally active and many times multi-thread. The South Fork has a relatively small drainage area, but it's lower slope and more sinuous and more unconfined, so there's a wider valley bottom. The middle main stem, again, is certainly multi-thread, relatively laterally active. And then as you move downstream of the Moose Creek Dam, which you can see here, the lower main stem portion becomes more sinuous and lower slope. So my collaborators on this project in 2017, before I was involved, they floated about 280 kilometers of this river network and mapped log jams. It's sort of an amazing, spatially extensive data set. And they mapped the log jams across the distribution of juvenile Chinook salmon occurrence. And here we've defined a logjam as commonly in the literature, 3 or more pieces of wood that exceed 1 meter in length and 10 centimeters in diameter. And they mapped local logjam characteristics such as bank location, the formative agent, what the logjam was sort of looked to be formed by, and others that I won't talk about today, but these are some of the aspects that I'll discuss. And because interior Alaska and Alaska in general has relatively outdated sort of hydrology digital data sets, we've derived variables using digital elevation models, using NetMap, which is sort of a model based on digital elevation, to get drainage area and slope all along this network, among other variables. They also looked at wood recruitment, so logs that are falling into the stream along this river network. And this part, as a geomorphologist, I'm quite envious of and sounds fun, but also cold. They did snorkel surveys of juvenile salmon use of log jams as habitat. So they did a random sample and adjusted the time spent surveying these log jams for fish use by the logjam size, and they counted individuals by species. Okay, so now I'm going to talk about some of the results that we have, and we're still working on this project, but we can look at logjam formation mechanism and how that highlights trapping locations across this network. So here we have the proportion of logjams by these different regions. And you can see the mechanism here on the side, and it's a bit busy, this plot, but some things that I want to highlight is that the most common mechanism include things like trees, bars, and banks. So log jams are being formed on those forming agents. And this really highlights both the importance of bars as a trapping location for jams, but also the channel margin floodplain edge. So how the channel and the floodplain and trees on the floodplain are really linked to log jam formation. In addition, one other thing to highlight is the South Fork is much more highly sinuous, and there's a higher proportion of jams in that area that are formed in meander bends, sort of similar to that photo I showed at the start on the Christian River. So we can also look at logjam count on reaches that are 500 meters in length. So we can divide up the river network into 500-meter length reaches and look at the logjam counts. And we find that logjam frequency decreases with increasing drainage area and also correspondingly decreasing slope. And so you can see these drainage areas are relatively high, right? So these are larger systems relative to a lot of studies. And we find that this decreasing in drainage area really points to likely the increasing transport capacity and channel size as you increase the drainage area relative to the piece size. So wood is getting trapped more at lower drainage areas and transported more and trapped less in higher drainage areas. If we average trends between these different sections, here we see log jams per kilometer versus drainage area. And then on this axis is recruits per kilometer, so those pieces that are falling in. And log jams are these brown circles, and recruits are the green triangles. And I've also labeled the different sections here on this plot. So if we average across these different areas of the network, we can begin to make some inferences about what's happening, what's controlling logjam formation. You see that the lower main stem has much fewer logjams and recruits, and Moose Creek Dam comes in right at the start of the lower main stem section. The South Fork and the headwaters, shown here, the South Fork has much fewer logjams and fewer recruits than the headwaters. And so I think this is because the South Fork is more sinuous, it has lower slope, less laterally active. So there's probably fewer wood pieces being input into that system, even though they're similar drainage area. So in summary here, the logjam frequency reflects transport capacity, again, as we see this sort of decline with increasing drainage area. Recruitment patterns, as the recruitment patterns tend to follow the logjam patterns in terms of trends, and then also planform morphology as well as human impacts. For the last part of this talk, I just want to mention these Moose Creek Dam impacts on the lower main stem section. So this is a picture of that dam. Water can flow freely through the dam unless there are high flows, and then they close the gates of the dam to reduce flooding for Fairbanks. So this is a picture of a flood in 1967 in downtown Fairbanks. So this dam was really built for flood control. Fish can pass through when it's open. There's also a fish ladder, but the dam traps wood. So what happens is that the dam traps wood. They remove the wood and they leave it on the side of the river. Some wood does make it through. This is downstream of that dam in Fairbanks, but most of it is put on the side of the river, and then people come and collect it as for firewood. But we don't have any quantification of this wood removal over time. So our ability to construct, say, a wood budget is really limited here, at least for now. But we are trying to think about, why does this section have such low numbers of logjams? And it is likely because of the wood removal, but also it could also be because of changing morphology due to the dam impacts. So there's been evidence of channel downcutting downstream of the dam on the Chena. And we know from other studies on dam impacts that dams can disrupt sediment delivery. They can cause incision downstream of dams. And in the reach just upstream of the dam, bars and side channel entrances are common locations of jam formation. So this is above the dam on the middle main stem, and you can see bars and side channel entrances are really important. And so we can just think qualitatively about how has the morphology changed since flood control. So maybe is there some simplification of the trapping ability of this section to form jams. And so log jams promote sediment deposition, but bars also trap wood and form jams. So there's this sort of feedback. And to look at this, we've looked at historic aerial imagery, and we can look at imagery before the dam was built and closed versus after the dam was built and closed, and at similar discharge levels to control for stage. And we can see this is two different segments. I divided the lower main stem into two different segments, that the percent of the channel as bars is reduced after the dam closure. So it could be that the dam both is trapping wood, but it's also simplifying the geomorphology and modifying the geomorphology to make the wood trapping potential lower in the lower main stem, which has a lot of implications for management of this system. So I also want to mention, you know, I didn't go into this very much in this talk, but a large part of this work led by the fish ecologists is about fish occurrence and density at these log jams. So here we can see the whole network. Red dots are where fish, Chinook juvenile salmon were not detected, and blue is where they were, and the size of the dot indicates the density of fish at those log jams. And you can see the percent of log jams occupied throughout most of the network, except for the lower main stem, is really high. So just to summarize this, I'll just bring up a few points. Log jam formation locations indicate the role of trapping locations and planform morphology. From this network, log jam frequency declines downstream, likely reflecting transport capacity. And dams likely impact the ability of the river corridor to trap wood. And the fish are really using these log jams. And so it's an important habitat feature for juvenile salmon. And I just want to end by discussing some future work. So because boreal river networks, they're extensively forested and they have a lot of log jams. And in my work in interior Alaska for other projects, it's become apparent that they really influence the morphodynamics in river systems. So they can help form side channels, but also influence subsequent side channel evolution and sedimentation. So you can see some pictures here. These are on the Tidrinjik River in interior Alaska. You can see log jams here from this float plane, these photos of jams accumulating at the entrances to side channels. And so I'm hoping to look at both how jams influence bar development over time. You can see this buried log jam and a head of bar log jam here, but also how jams influence planform. So these wandering gravel bed systems where they're multi-thread and relatively laterally active. And so hoping to use more remote sensing and dating methods to look at these questions. So I just want to acknowledge the funding and field assistance and see if there are any questions if there's time. And thank you so much.
Thank you everyone for being here. Thanks for the invitation and organizing all this. I'm Sam Munoz. I am an assistant professor at Northeastern University. I'm going to be talking to you today about work that we have been doing that's really interested in river history and especially flood history. But to do it, we're usually borrowing really heavily from ideas and tools in geomorphology, particularly fluvial geomorphology. And the motivation for that work is really to understand, in part, how river systems, and particularly the sort of hydrologic aspects of river systems, will respond to changes in climate. Because as we go forward in this sort of greenhouse forced world, we actually don't know very well, and I'll show this in just a minute, how river systems are going to respond to changes in climate. So there we go. Why should we care about rivers? They're super important economically. So this is just an image of the lower Mississippi River, where a lot of the work I'll talk about today is focused on. The lower Mississippi is really important for shipping, for industry. We have agriculture along it and upstream. And so any changes in the hydrology or morphology of a big river like this has big economic implications. And as we go forward in the future with a changing climate and changing hydrology and changing sort of hydroclimatology, there are big questions about how big rivers like the Mississippi and others will respond. And so here are just two examples from two studies that have come out in the last decade or so, using projections of the future for just this one river, the lower Mississippi. And on the left, I'm showing just a figure from Vanderveel et al. This was published in GRL, I believe, or Water Resource Research recently. The journal doesn't matter, but basically they're showing that flow will decrease, discharge will decrease. And this is just showing sort of annual average, but they essentially are showing that flow decreases across all return periods. So whether it's a big flood or a little flood, flow goes down. And they attribute that mostly to a decrease in snowpack and snowmelt. But that's one thing. In a warmer world, you're going to have less snowmelt, right? But then there are other studies that say that discharge will increase in this world. And usually that's attributed to, well, precip becomes more extreme. And so there's this big question about, in a warmer world, how do rivers respond? And so there are lots of ways that you can try to solve this problem, and lots of ways that people have. One way that we are tackling this is to look to the past, look to history. Not that far back in the past, we don't have to go very far to go to a previous sort of moderately warmer or warming period. In this part of the world, what we call the medieval era. So about 1,000 years ago, sometimes it's called the medieval climate anomaly, sometimes it's called the medieval warm period, whatever you want to call it. We know from tree ring work, here showing Ed Cook's PDSI drought atlas from this time, showing that, yeah, it was drier, and that's been well known for a long time. There's other work from dune fields in the same region, also showing that, again, it was drier, particularly in the summer months. And there's other sort of paleoclimate proxies, again, that show that this period of time was drier, and we knew that. We recently published a branched GDGT temperature reconstruction from this period as well, from this region as well. I'm sort of right smack dab in the middle of the Mississippi River Basin. And it also shows that this period not only was drier, but was also warmer, right? And so this medieval era can serve as I wouldn't say it's a perfect analog, but it's say a partial analog for the sort of warmer future that we're facing. And we can look to see how the Mississippi responded during this previous warm period, and whether model simulations from that time sort of track that well or not, and think about what that means for the future. And so today I'll talk about sort of two different techniques that we've been using to look at changes in stream flow in the past. The first one, it depends on some of these scaling laws that were developed by geomorphologists, half a century ago, that relate properties of the channel, of river channels, to the discharge that goes through them. In other words, the form of river channels reflects their function. I'm sure a lot of people here are familiar with this work, pioneered by Luna Leopold and his colleagues. So what we're going to use here is the sinuosity of the river as sort of a proxy for discharge. In particular, we're looking at sort of a 2-year discharge, so a very small sort of average flood. On the right here, I'm showing just a plot of from Leopold and Woolman way back in 1970. They looked at a bunch of rivers in the United States and a few in India to come up with this function that related discharge, again, of the bankful discharge of the 2-year flood roughly to the meander wavelength of that river. That's what this blue line is showing. We went back very quickly and just looked through Google Earth and picked a bunch of sites in North and South America and a few in Asia, and just quickly measured the meander wavelength of a bunch of meanders, and then got the discharge for those sites from a reanalysis product. And yeah, I mean, our line kind of matches more or less the Leopold and Woolman line, suggesting that, yeah, there's a scaling law here between the meander wavelength and the discharge. And this work was led by a PhD candidate in my group, Charlotte Wyman, and she published this just last year in GRL. And so what we're going to do to get sort of past how channel geometry changed in the past, we're actually going to use these really old maps by Harold Fisk. They were published in 1944 of the lower Mississippi River. And what Fisk and his collaborators did was they show on this map, this is just one section of the map. There's, I think, 14 panels that go all the way from the confluence of the Ohio all the way down almost to the outlet. But the white is the channel as it was in 44, and then all these other lines, all these other colored lines are paleo channels, essentially where the channel was at different times in the past. And now Fisk, he didn't have radiocarbon dating to know the ages of those, but he estimated that sort of each, you can get the relative order, and he estimated that each segment going back was separated by about 100 years. We have since cored a ton of the oxbow lakes that are left behind from these meander scars. And yeah, more or less, he's right that each of these sequences, each of these paleo channels is separated by about 100 years. We can put ages on these things. And so we did that, and then Charlotte digitized all of these channels for the whole length of the lower Mississippi, and then we computed meander wavelength and sinuosity at each stage, and that's what's shown on the right here. So in red, so on the x-axis is time, so we're going back about 1,500 years or so, and the y-axis in red is meander wavelength, and blue is sinuosity estimated from these maps. And so what do we see? We see that meander wavelength goes way down in the medieval era, and sinuosity kind of mirrors it, which is what we expect. In blue, it goes up, and then as we move sort of towards the present, meander wavelength increases and increases and increases, and then after in the 20th century, we sort of artificially straightened the lower Mississippi, and so we see that as this sort of big uptick in meander wavelength. But you know that trend had been going on for quite a while. And so in terms of what this means for discharge, it means that at least based on this sort of weird proxy of meander wavelength, that in the medieval era, that implies that the 2-year discharge went down. So that's what we're showing here. Again, time on the x-axis, meander wavelength, the thing you just saw in black. So that's cool. If I think that were on its own, I might not necessarily trust it. It's kind of a weird proxy, and it's unclear if the scaling laws are working over multiple orders of magnitude. Is that really valid within an order of magnitude? And so to sort of check this, we compared it to a model simulation. So this is the CESM last millennium ensemble. CESM is pretty cool because it has all the normal, the many variables that a general circulation model has, but it also has a river routing model. So it essentially has a built-in hydrologic model. And so we can look at what CESM thinks discharge was doing over the last 1,000 years or so. And so when we look at what CESM, this model, thinks discharge was doing, it's this blue line. And when I first saw this, I kind of didn't believe it for a minute, because yeah, I mean, it's kind of showing that, yeah, discharge goes down in this medieval era, and then it kind of goes up towards the historical period. And it really kind of matches pretty nicely the black line here. And then, of course, we already knew that this period was warmer, this medieval era, in observations, and the model thinks that too, that it was quite a bit warmer and it sort of cooled more towards present. We took this one step further and we asked the model, okay, so do you think discharge goes down in the medieval period? Why does it go down? What's the hydrologic variable that's really driving this change? And sort of long story short, the big thing that the model at least thinks that's driving this change is evaporation. That it's a warmer atmosphere, that warmer atmosphere takes up more water, and so we have more loss and thus a lower flow. There is also like a slight decrease in precip and a little bit of a decrease in snow melt, but the sort of the big kahuna seems to be this sort of increase in evaporation in a warmer atmosphere. And so that kind of gives us a sense of it tells us two things. One, it tells us that CESM seems to do a pretty good job at simulating stream flow in this part of the world over the last sort of 1,000 years, which is cool. I'd love to check that in other ways, but as sort of a first glance, that seems like it's not doing a terrible job. And then it also allows us to think about the future and what that means for the future. And so this medieval era is sort of probably pretty moderate warming compared to some of the high emission scenario that we're going in the future. But we can also ask CESM, since it did a pretty good job in the past, what do you think about the future for this river? And that's what we're plotting here. This is a paper that's in review now, being led by Kieran Dunn, who's now a postdoc at Caltech, I believe. And Kieran looked at the CESM large ensemble, so same model, but a different set of outputs, and looked at what it thought about the Mississippi in the future. And essentially, under a moderate emission scenario, it sees sort of, not much change, not really a decrease, but not really an increase. Whereas a high emission scenario sees a big increase. And this seems to hold true for a lot of temperate river systems, that at sort of moderate amounts of warming, the increase from extreme precip is sort of offset by losses to evaporation and snowmelt. Whereas if you really increase the emission scenario and you really go crazy and warm the climate, then extreme precip sort of takes over and outweighs these other hydrologic losses. So that seems to be where this is headed, and what our data is telling us so far. The other thing I just sort of wanted to talk about with my remaining minutes here is another way that we can use fluviogeomorphology and sedimentology to think about flooding in the past, but a way that we can think about flooding in sort of an episodic way, and more thinking about extreme floods. So if the sort of sinuosity thing, meander wavelength thing is telling us about sort of the 2-year flood, sort of your sort of average small flood, we want to know about big floods and how those changed in the past. And so a technique that I and others have used is to look at the sedimentary archives that are held in floodplain lakes. And so the way to think about this is that, you know, here's one of our field sites, Lake Mary on the lower Mississippi. The way to think about this is that normally, you know, the river's doing its thing and it's flowing along downstream, and there's maybe some hydrologic connectivity with floodplain lakes and the floodplains, but not a ton of sediment is being transferred. But then when these rivers flood, suddenly these paleochannels that oftentimes get reoccupied by the channel, and suddenly sediment starts to move more easily in these. Velocity can often slow, and you can get these deposits of material inside these lakes. And those deposits are essentially a sort of a proxy of telling us that a flood occurred. And so, like I said, we've used this before, and others have used this before. Here's an example of just the top of the sediment core pulled out of Lake Mary. Here, when we first visited Lake Mary, all the houses are up on stilts, which is a great sign that it still floods, and we could still see the flood lines from recent events, including the 2011 flood line here. So here's the 2011 flood line on a house, and here's 2 people for scale, and the lake is right behind them. So we know this area gets inundated during these events. When we just look at a sediment core, just the very top 20 centimeters in that core, we can see signs of floods passing. So we were there in 2016 for the first time, and a flood had just recently occurred, and there's this sort of coarser, denser band in the top that we dated using a bunch of things, cesium, lead-210, OSL, radiocarbon, to date it, you know, to recent times. And then the flood of record in this region is 2011. There's another one of these layers that dates to 2011. So we felt pretty confident that we could use this technique to look at floods in the past. And we did. And so we published that a few years ago, went back about 500 years. The other thing that we and others have been using in these contexts is the grain size of those deposits. In other words, the texture of those deposits as sort of a proxy for the magnitude of the flood that occurred. And so the thinking here is that, well, a bigger flood, more discharge is going to erode and thus deposit coarser material. And so we can look at the relationship between the texture of a deposit and build a model that relates the texture of that deposit back to the discharge that produced it. So this was first published a few years ago by Willem Tonen in Katina, and he showed for a bunch of sites on the Rhine River this really nice, pretty strong linear relationship between historical floods that he observed in terms of their grain size and the discharge that produced them. And so then he applies this linear model back in time to estimate flood magnitudes back in time. And we did the same thing, and others have done this as well. And it's a pretty powerful tool because it suddenly gives you a way to look at extreme flood magnitudes in the past. And when you do that, you can really constrain frequency analysis. So here's an example of us using our record from the lower Mississippi to basically constrain the flood frequency analysis for the lower Mississippi River at Vicksburg. And so in black is sort of the unregulated flows without paleoflood data, and then the red one is with paleoflood data, and you can just see how the confidence intervals go down. And this was work published last year by a PhD candidate in my group, Yuri Reinders. So that's cool. One thing that Yuri has been doing since then, though, is seeing if we can improve on this technique a little bit. Because, you know, as the geomorphologists in this room can attest, that idea that the grain size is going to sort of linearly relate to the discharges probably overly simplistic. We know that these are really dynamic systems. The channel is going to move, the lake's going to fill in over time. And so all that is probably going to affect the properties of the deposit that you're getting at any particular point in the lake. And so he's been playing around with a hydraulic model, namely HEC-RAS. He built this really nice hydraulic model for a section of the Trinity River where we had a nicely mapped channel and floodplain and this lake here. And just to show you, this is what the hydraulic model says is happening during Hurricane Harvey. And his model is doing pretty good when we compare it to the gauge data. So we're feeding his model stages at 2 gauges nearby, and it's spitting out discharge. And it's a pretty good fit, particularly during the peak of the flow. And so in this lake, we also went and collected some cores this last summer, and those cores kind of show what we expect. They show that as we're closer to the river channel in the lake, we have coarser material being deposited during a big event like Hurricane Harvey. And as we move further into the lake, sort of away from the channel, that material finds out, again, is what we expect. And also that the deposits get thinner as we move away. So the deposits from an event like Hurricane Harvey are very big, 50 centimeters when we're near the channels, and we move away, they get thinner and thinner. But then we've also played around with this idea that, you know, these lakes are going to fill in over time. And what does that mean for deposition? And so here are just playing around with that lake and looking at the differences in flow velocity during a Harvey-like event. But here the lake is infilled with 1 meter of sediment, 2 meters of sediment, and 4 meters of sediment. And you can see how the velocity profile during an event like this changes. And so what we'd expect would be that the depositional center and the characteristics are going to change over time as the lake infills. Which is cool to see this. We kind of know this, but it's really cool to see it. And I think it also means that we could use these kind of hydraulic models to essentially improve on those linear relationships and sort of back calculate the discharge associated with any event that we see by doing this kind of historical reconstruction. So I'm out of time. Thank you for listening. My sort of 2 takeaways here were just that we can use geomorphology, and particularly fluvial geomorphology, as this sort of path to understand the hydrologic past. And a lot of my work and a lot of the work I showed you today is sort of integrating observations, you know, cores, maps, whatever, with models to both strengthen the inference about the hydrologic past and then using that to help us constrain the future. And with that, I'll just say thanks to our funding agencies and many collaborators and the students. I tried to mention them properly, and other field assistants and things. Thanks.
Okay. Can you guys see the video or Corey's?
Yeah, looks like
That's good. Okay, let's see if we can hear it.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks so much for joining. Wish I could be there with you virtually right now.
Can you all hear it?
I'm sorry I have to do this
Yeah.
as a recording, but
Okay.
I do hope you enjoy it and hope we can continue the conversation afterwards. I want to talk to you about a repeat high-resolution LiDAR project that I worked on as part of my dissertation to characterize how debris flows move down the hill in the southern Appalachians in North Carolina in the USA. So where are we? We're on the eastern side of the United States. We're in the southern Appalachian Mountains. We are right at the intersection of the Piedmont Physiographic Province and the Blue Ridge Mountains Physiographic Province. So these areas are separated by this zone of very steep topography, this passive margin of escarpment known as the Blue Ridge Escarpment. The terrain through here is very rugged, several hundred meters of local relief, and you might notice that there are a couple of river systems that are moving across the escarpment. We see these all the way from Georgia up through Virginia, where these transverse drainages
We've lost sound, Marissa.
and these areas received up to 150 millimeters of rain in a 3-hour period on Friday, May 18. I actually live right between these and experienced this rainfall. As a former boss once said, it was a frog strangler. So when this happened, a lot of landslides initiated. These were shallow landslides that kicked off during this convective event. So we had some areas that received over 250 millimeters of rainfall that day, and we had over 240 landslides that we mapped with the North Carolina Geological Survey. During the storm, there were 3 fatalities, one of which shown up here in this home on the top right was directly from the impact of a debris flow. The others was from a falling tree associated with the storm. You can see just how tall some of these debris flows were moving down the hill, and some of these effects on the trees on the lateral flanks. So what data did we have? Well, thankfully, in 2017, North Carolina collected statewide lidar as part of a larger program that covered the area we're working in. And that was we resolved that to a 0.5 meter resolution DTM. And then Dr. Wegman and myself worked with the folks at NCALM, and we had some 2020 data collected. So we had these very high resolution LiDAR data sets bracketing this 2018 landslide event. You can see on the right, this GIF is cycling through the various data sets. And what's showing is one of the large, slow-moving landslides that initiated during this time. And then also in 2019 to 21, the North Carolina Geological Survey initiated countywide mapping of both historical and recent landslides from this 2018 event. And so when we did that, we just published this paper, Wooten et al. 2021. You can see the reference up here. This is a map showing kind of the density of landslides from the May 2018 event. And you'll notice that here in the Pacolet River Gorge and the Green River Gorge, we see that highest density of landslides. And again, we know that these transverse drainages historically, they form focal points for mass wasting. We saw that pattern emerge here in this recent event as well. So the geological setup for this, the gorges are largely similar. We transition from a biotite gneiss up here in the green to an amphibole dominated gneiss down in the Pacolet Gorge, but largely the rock types are similar. The fracturing is relatively similar. The foliations are not too different. So we really don't have much geologically separating these two geomorphic features. Both of them have very rocky soils, a lot of exposed cliff bands. And again, we were working with something like 300 to 700 meters of local relief. So from the 240 initiating landslides, many of them transitioned into debris flows. We selected 54 debris flows for analysis that occurred during that storm. And they're relatively equally spread here between the two gorges. So let's talk for a second about how the debris flows initiate in the Southern Appalachians. We're working in heavily forested terrain. This photo here shows a good example of what our study area would have looked like in May. Given the growing season is coming in, the leaves are on the trees. This is kind of what it would have looked like. We have a lot of topographic convexities on the noses, and we also have these concavities or these topographic hollows that form, and they collect heavy deposits of colluvium. The topographic concavity directs water into the hollow, where we eventually destabilize that soil mass, and you have some initiating landslide. Whether it's translational or rotational, we have a kind of a discrete landslide that kicks off. If it happens in one of these hollows, it's often in very close proximity to a channel that's funneling rainwater off of the surface, and that can mobilize into that debris flow. So in this example here, this is from North Carolina as well, but it's a totally different event. But that's exactly what happened. There was an initiating landslide, the source zone kind of shown here, before that mobilized into a full-blown debris flow. So that's what's happening during these rainfall triggered events. So now what do we do, right? We have this information, how do we use it best? So here on the right is an example of a LiDAR change detection image. And so in this, blues are the erosion, reds are the deposition, and we can do some change detection to understand where the debris flows happened and to what level of intensity, how much erosion, how much deposition occurred at different points along the hill slope. Here are just a few field photos from mapping, just showing that, again, this is not a new process for this part of the world. We experienced or encountered numerous historical debris flow deposits during our mapping. It's a very fun place to map. So now we can look at some of the debris flow forensics. We can really start to break these debris flows down into their constituent parts. And typically what we see, again, we have some initiation zone. It's actually really clear in this example where that initiating landslide occurred. And then we have a dominantly erosive section of the debris flow, and then we get down to the debris fan. And at some point, right, we can map this transition from erosion to deposition. So to look at this further, instead of just thinking about entire debris flow statistics, right? What is the total volume or the total area, right? Those are great, and we do use that. I'll show some of that later. But I wanted to think about how can we march down the debris flow track, starting at the top, and compute statistics along the way that's going to help us understand really the dynamics of what's occurring from the top to the bottom. So the methodology we used is to march down in 10-meter increments and develop polygons, right? So the extent of the debris flow is mapped from field mapping, aerial lidar, aerial imagery, just all kinds of methods. You can read more in the Wooten paper I linked earlier about our methods. But from that, we can then compute the change for each polygon. So in this example, from the head down to 10 meters along the track, we eroded 233 cubic meters. Then between meters 10 and 20 down the track, an additional 260 cubic meters in this example. So now we know that at 20 meters down the track, this debris flow has eroded 493 cubic meters, just to give you an example. And we just march all the way down these debris flows, computing these values. When we do this, we come up with two primary ways to think about it, right? One is just that cumulative volume. So how much volume came off of the hillside? And then we also can normalize that to the distance. So then we say, what's that total volume divided by whatever distance we are down the track? So when we plot these values up, we can get a plot like this for any given debris flow, where we can see a couple things. Let's first focus on the blue line here. This is just the cumulative volume of the debris flow. So we're just watching that total eroded volume rise all the way up to some point before we start to deposit material, which happens right here. We can see just based on the color change, you start to deposit material. Another way to look at that is the normalized volume. You can think of this as the growth rate, right? This is the cubic meters of material that's entering the debris flow per additional meter of debris flow. So as we would expect with that initiating debris slide, we have a very high value here. So for the first 10 meters of the debris flow, 60 cubic meters per meter were entering the flow. And then that value quickly drops off and comes to some level here that stays relatively consistent for the duration of the flow. So both of these plots you would expect to start and end at zero, but they don't. And there's a number of reasons. I hope you check out the paper once it is published here to see more. But the easiest example of why, in this case, some 3,000 cubic meters were removed from this basin, we don't have them accounted for in our cumulative volume plots, because if you look at this DEM, you might notice this stream right here, it's flowing to the south in this example. And so certainly we would expect a lot of this deposit material transitioned into a debris flood. It's raining heavily, right? All the rivers are charging right now. And so this stream would have picked up a lot of material and carried it on downslope. And in this case, we would estimate maybe something like 3,000 cubic meters. So now let's look at, let's just dig in a little bit further, right? We've talked about these three different zones. Now let's look at these normalized volume curves, and let's look at a lot of them. And so when you take a look at what I call a spaghetti plot, right? When we look at all of these curves together, it might seem a little bit tough. Like what exactly is going on, right? What we've done here is the normalized volume, but we've also normalized it to the distance. So now instead of looking and now we're just looking from the beginning of the debris flow to the end, right? That's the focus. So we can compare debris flows of varying distances. And when we start to subset these into different populations, in this case, we have 28 total debris flows we analyzed for this. Half of them were in the green, half in the Pacolet. We see a strikingly similar pattern emerge of these rapid increases representing that initial debris slide, the decay, off to some relatively stable value that in most cases is decreasing just a little bit throughout the duration of the debris flow. We can characterize this mathematically, and I think this is the really cool part of this study. This is what got me probably most excited is seeing this power law decay during the erosive phase of the debris flow. So on this plot here on the left, this is that initial debris slide. We're not considering that for this mathematical characterization. On the right, we have the depositional phase. Again, we're not considering that, but just looking at the erosive phase. To a very high degree of confidence with our R-squared values, we can characterize the decay of the debris flow growth rate according to a very simple power law. And we can compute the best fit A and B parameters for these populations. And this is super exciting, right? Because now we have a method that others can use. Anybody out there that's sitting on repeat LiDAR could think about this, and we could come up with some different A and B parameters and then start to understand maybe why they're different in different environments or in different geologies, or what do they look like in seismic, co-seismic landslides and debris flows versus rainfall triggered. So now we're going to jump over to talking a little bit about the mobility of the debris flow. So this is a great measure of how destructive a debris flow is. And this is where we're going to get away from that kind of a long track analysis and move into more of these debris flow statistics as a whole type of analysis. So it's well known that the mobility scales with volume of a debris flow. So this is a correlation put forth by Munoz 1996, where they show this very well. This is great. The problem with this, if you're looking at forecasting debris flow runout and inundation, the debris flow has to happen for you to know the volume, or you have to estimate the volume. Either way, these are places where we potentially are introducing further error into the analysis. So I propose, so we propose that actually maybe drainage area is a better indicator for debris flow mobility. And we can show you this, okay? So for our study, looking at the volume of the debris flow versus the mobility as measured, we do see a similar pattern to Munoz and others who have done this. But our R-squared is relatively low. When we do the exact same computation, but using drainage area as a proxy for that mobility, we get a much stronger R-squared. And I think the reason that this makes intuitive sense is because that increase in water, which is coming during a rainstorm, during a rainfall triggered landslide event, all the drainage area is contributing surface water flow. And of course, that's going to make all of our debris flows a little bit closer to the debris flood side of the spectrum. So of course, they're going to go further for a given height drop, which is really that mobility statistic. So now if we can accept that and we say, okay, drainage area drives mobility, that's great. Now, does it also, it would stand to reason that it also then allows these debris flow toes to extend out further, to go over lower and lower ground slope before they deposit. And that has huge implications for hazard and risk modeling, right? And in fact, we do see that as well. So as drainage area goes up, the slope that a debris flow can travel across goes down. So they can go over gentler slopes when you have a large contributing drainage area. So again, why is this cool? Well, because we can measure this today, right? We can generate drainage area computations at the mouth of any debris flow that we expect might happen. And we can do this before the landslides ever occur. We can do it globally, and we can use that to calibrate models. So to wrap this up, I presented kind of two different types of findings here today based on this repeat LiDAR. One of which is I think a totally new finding. I'm super curious to hear from you all on what you think about this. But we find that growth rate decays according to a power law that we can describe mathematically. And I think that's cool because coming into this project, I would have guessed that the debris flows got more and more powerful as far as how much material they were introducing to the flow mass as you came down the hill. But it's really not the case. That growth rate actually decays from the top to the bottom. And then we also showed that drainage area may be a better proxy for debris flow mobility compared to the previously accepted proxy of volume. And then part and parcel with that, we can also estimate at what ground slope we're going to start to deposit material, which has huge implications for debris flow modeling. Thank you so much for your attention and interest. Need to give several acknowledgements here to folks from NCALM, the North Carolina Geological Survey, USGS, and the North Carolina Department of Public Safety. And also be remiss not to thank the good people of Polk County who are nothing but supportive of our mapping efforts and response efforts following this event. And please do get in touch. We'd love to hear what you think. I'm very curious how this will be accepted by the community and what other thoughts folks have on next steps. And if anybody has repeat LiDAR on some debris flows and you want to talk about some of these methods and how we can implement them, I would love to hear from you. So any one of these methods here will connect with me, and thanks again.
Let me quickly share my screen here. Thank you all for being here this afternoon or whatever time zone you're in. I'm Daniella Rempe. I'm an assistant professor at the University of Texas at Austin, and I'm super excited to share with you some observations of a part of landscapes that are typically pretty hard to characterize in the subsurface. And so I'll just start off with this imagery here and have you imagine, if you can, think about what the structure of soils and weathering might look like under a landscape like this, and we'll get to the results about midway through the talk. But try to think about what principles you might rely on to envision what the subsurface might be doing with respect to its structure and its ability to store and convey water to channel networks. So all the credit from everything that is shown in this talk does not go to me, but it goes to all these wonderful folks whose faces you'll see throughout the presentation. So we know as geomorphologists, and of course this is going to be a bit of a departure from what you've seen earlier today, but we know the near surface and subsurface properties have mediated Earth's climate and sediment transport and water transport, water cycling, carbon cycling, on and on. And so understanding the subsurface becomes pretty important when we try to think about rates of things like weathering or CO2 drawdown due to weathering. So I'm showing you here a silly picture of cabbage because we are challenged when we try to think about the way the subsurface is structured in places like those that are pictured on the left with mountainous or hilly topography. And so this notion of the critical zone has been developed to kind of encapsulate this near surface region that many of you are very, very familiar with, comprised in many places of thin soils underlain by extensive weathered bedrock, and at some depth, perhaps bedrock that hasn't yet felt the forces associated with being near the surface, whether they're stresses associated with topography or reactive fluids that have penetrated deeply enough to alter the minerals. There is at some depth perhaps a boundary, and so above that we call that the critical zone as it impacts the fluxes of things that we care about, like water and solutes, nutrients, streams, and so on. And so it's long been recognized that this weathered bedrock region hosts dynamic water storage, either in the form of groundwater, pictured at the bottom here, or in the rock as unsaturated moisture, which we'll call rock moisture for convenience, but is simply just an extension of soil moisture into the weathered rock. And so it's long been known that water moves through this weathered bedrock region and that plants can access this for water, and not just in times of drought, as I'll show you, but some plants can rely more extensively on this zone than they do soils, particularly in places where soils are very thin. And so we already begin to see how the biosphere is connected to the lithosphere in the sense that plants are actively responding to environmental variables and then transmitting a signal either in the form of, say, root exudates or the extraction of water and introduction of atmospheric gases into the rock and generating this weathering engine within the critical zone. So we have water, we have plants, and now we start to think about carbon and solutes and the ways in which plants are impacting the carbon cycle, not just because they are these storage reservoirs for carbon, but also because they might mobilize carbon that's stored within, say, marine sedimentary rocks, or they might impart reactivity deeper into the rock where minerals can be dissolved and transported either in groundwater in the unsaturated zone to streams. And so this kind of cascading impact of roots and rock emerges where we see that the structure of the critical zone and the extent to which it is a water supply for plants and can conduct fluid to streams becomes important when we start to think about the role of the subsurface in, say, long-term carbon cycling or chemical denudation. And so we know, looking into the future, or we have some evidence at least, that flow paths are changing because plants are changing and land use is changing. And so there's this idea that it's important for us to understand what's happening presently to better understand future states and how watersheds might store and release water and solutes in the future under different rooting extents. And so my group tends to be really stuck below ground, trying to instrument the subsurface to better understand water storage, carbon fluxes, solute fluxes. And so I'll share with you some of the things that we've been working on in my group, and I'm going to try to address these three questions here. Is bedrock water just a thing that happens in some places, or is it really important? Is it an important part of the water cycle? How does it function, particularly when plants are stressed? And what is the role of the structure of the subsurface in dictating how plants might respond to environmental stressors? And then what are the biogeochemical consequences? And by that I mean, how does water transport in weathered and fractured rock impact transport of solutes and carbon or nutrients? Excuse me. So I'm showing here an image of above ground biomass in the continental US. For those of you who know the North American geography well, you'll notice that there's a lot of biomass in places that are pretty thinly soil mantled. And so immediately we can start to see that maybe perhaps the biomass established on rock is not this uncommon thing. And so we want to ask how much water really is being moved here. And we used remote sensing, hydrologic fluxes, and some soil data from the US Soil Survey to effectively do a mass balance that allowed us to estimate the amount of water. It's pretty much a minimum estimate. It's covered in this paper here, published this last year. With lead author Erica McCormick, where we estimate the amount of water that is extracted from bedrock over large scales. And the map I'm showing you here shows some of those results that indicate that in places that are shown in green, bedrock water use occurs every single year, not just during drought or not just during extensively dry years. And there's some caveats here that our ability to detect bedrock water use requires extensive dry periods, which is why you see more bedrock water use in California than you might on the eastern side of the US. It's a limitation of our ability to detect that. But at any rate, we see a large area where there is a significant amount of biomass that is interacting directly with rock in some ways, circulating water, circulating nutrients in some way. And this happens across the world. There's some studies shown here on this map. And if you take some characteristics like MAP or temperature or lithology, which is not plotted here, I'm noticing it's not showing up. What we find is that this isn't really limited to a particular rock type or a particular climate, but rather quite pervasive and occurs anywhere where we might find sufficient precipitation on rock to support plants. And so there's evidence also in the field shown in the top right of a select number of places in California and Texas where people have constrained the actual volumes of water that have been used from rock. And we show a little bit of agreement here with our remotely sensed estimates that are shown as bars of the bedrock water use across here, shown in California and Texas, that there's a lot of water and often a big fraction of precipitation that is stored and then subsequently withdrawn from rock every year, suggesting that plants are driving a deep water cycling, and in doing that, changing the gas phase transport properties that perhaps promote the reactivity delivery deeper into the critical zone and chemical denudation. And so, as I said, this happens over a number of biomes and climates, and isn't necessarily associated with one particular rock type. So when we go and think about how this rock water storage functions, we go to some field sites, and I'll show you, this is the work of a big team associated with the Eel River CZO. We go across 3 sites in Northern California that allow us to essentially keep rock type more or less constant, plus or minus the extent of metamorphism, but we see very different vegetation across these sites, as you can see in these little squares with aerial imagery of the sites. And so we have this distinct wet and dry season that allows us to relate the amount of water that's delivered in the wet season to the amount of water that's extracted by plants in the dry season. For example, at the Eel River Critical Zone Observatory, one shown here in the upper left, here's a cross section through the site, just as an illustration of how extensively we instrument these sites to better understand this kind of more mysterious weathering locus, this rock moisture storage zone. And we use a lot of different techniques to try to detect water and solute fluxes there, including something like this, this Vado zone monitoring system, where we've installed these sub-horizontal boreholes outfitted with some sensors and samplers that allow us to capture the actual water that's moving through the system, which is something that's eluded us for some time. We typically use water from soils and water from groundwater and some understanding of the solid phase to better understand what happens in between soil and groundwater. In this case, we actually have the fluid composition. It's been really incredible to start to open up that part of the critical zone by making these observations. We also use geophysical techniques to document the volumes of water stored and when they're added and depleted. And so we have a seasonal cycle of wetting and drying that we've observed at a number of sites across Northern California, where we see that in the rock, we can achieve what the soil scientists might call field capacity, but within deeply weathered rock. And so we reach a maximum amount of water storage in a given year, and then we deplete that water storage during the dry season. I'll skip ahead here. And we use nuclear magnetic resonance, a technique that's long been used in the petroleum industry. We've been applying it recently to the near surface to connect the pore size and the distribution of pore sizes produced in part by weathering and fracturing to the mobility of fluid and to the water potential or to the energy status of that water to document its availability to plants. And so we've been using NMR across these sites. And what we've been able to do, and I'll draw your attention to this bottom panel here, is link the water content, i.e. the volume of water, to the extent to which it undergoes this magnetization decay, this signal in our NMR data collection. The shape of this curve tells us about the surface area to volume ratio of the pores, or of water in the pores. And water in the pores, as it's distributed, the thicker the water films, the more energetically favorable, or the easier it is for plants to use that water. And so we've been able to develop this relationship between water content and a proxy for water potential, which is a necessary measurement to better understand water transport. We call it pedotransfer functions in soil science or soil sciences or vadosome science. So we've been able to extend this to fractured bedrock, which is very exciting for us. And we've seen strong connections between the water, the way in which water is held, and the structure of the critical zone. And I'm showing here two examples. On the left, we see at different depths, colored in different colors here, we have different relationships between the water content and water potential. So the way in which rock weathers impacts water retention and the ability of plants to access that water, or how mobile it might be under the force of gravity as well. So how easily it may be drained. And then we also see differences across a hill slope. So for example, at the same depth, but in different locations along the hill slope, we see at the divide, based on drill cuttings, we typically see more extensive weathering at the sites that we've been monitoring. And that tends to be associated with easier to mobilize fluids at a given water content, and then less extensive weathering down slope. And we have a harder time pulling out water at the same water content. And so the incorporation of information about rock weathering into water cycling and solute transport is one of our aims, and something that these data have been really critical in doing. And so I'll move on to this next part of the talk about how precipitation variability or how climate variability might impact water supply to trees. And I'll go through this as quickly as I possibly can, because I'm noticing now the time. The time has run quickly. So At this site, the image that I showed you in the first slide and that intro slide is from this site here on the right, also shown here on the bottom left. And I asked you to guess what the structure of the critical zone might be here. And our goal here was to drill extensively to better characterize the structure, to ask questions like, what is the role of hill slope length scale or the dissection of these hill slopes in dictating the pattern of weathering? And so we see this common pattern across these hill slopes, which gives us some comfort in the sense that we might be able to scale findings at one hill slope across a watershed based on things we might be able to measure, like hill slope length. And so this is presented in the Pedrasas et al. 2021 JGR surface paper, if you're interested in learning more. And so what we've been able to do by measuring rock moisture, water storage, and bedrock across these 3 sites is develop a framework for understanding how climate variability affects plant water stress. And what we found in 2 sites, one on the left deeply weathered and one in the middle very shallow weathering, that received the same amount of precipitation, that in every year, despite how much precipitation is falls, we have very similar amounts of water that are taken up by plants in the dry season. In a sense, the storage, the weathering, and the water retention in the rock limits the amount of water that could be stored. So in years that it rains a lot, that excess rain does not go into storage and does not serve the plants. Now on the right-hand side, we have this site that I just showed you. Its critical zone structure is deeply weathered, and yet it receives about 1/3 of the rain as these other sites. And we can see that in, as it manifests in terms of the vegetation community and biomass, but it's deeply weathered. So why is it not storing infinite water for use by plants? And also, how does it respond to climate variability? And what we've seen is that in different years, and skip ahead here, sorry, in different years, down here is rock moisture storage. If you get more rain, you store more. If you get less rain, you store less. This sets up hydrologic memory. And so there's a relationship between the amount that it rains and the depth of weathering that dictates the extent to which a particular place might be vulnerable. And so it's kind of counterintuitive that deep weathering might lead to, or extensive potential for rock moisture storage might lead to additional vulnerability. And that is because of the fact that in a wet year, you may store more, but in a dry year or in continuous consecutive dry years, you may deplete that storage, you may deplete that large reservoir over time and create this vulnerability. And so we've been exploring this across California using remote sensing data to try to identify places that are what we would call storage capacity limited, meaning that the depth of weathering, or this is a gross simplification, but that the depth of weathering might limit depth and extent relative to the precipitation, limits the amount of water that can be stored. And these are places that are relatively stable in terms of being invulnerable to plant mortality. This is work that's currently underway, and we are working on comparing these data to mortality data and so on. And so in the last moments of this talk, I just want to impart to you the significant consequences of rooting into bedrock and withdrawal of water by trees from bedrock. And that we've learned through monitoring water fluxes using this vadozone monitoring system I'm showing you here on the right. This is the work of Allison Toon and Jenny Druin. And what we find is a very vigorous and deep carbon cycling. We see concentrations of carbon dioxide that are comparable and rates of production that are comparable to that observed in tropical soils. And so there's a lot of CO2 that's being produced. And this is where that reactivity that I was talking about is coming from. These deep roots are consuming oxygen, but not all of the way. This is a depth profile from this system here. They're consuming oxygen and producing CO2, and that has an impact on the bedrock weathering processes and reactions that occur here. And we see a distinct seasonality and we look at this relative to Solu data, we see that the seasonality is critical to incorporate into our models of how plants impact weathering. And the last thing I'd like to share is that this CO2 production has consequences for what ends up in streams. And so here I'm showing you the flux of CO2 gas to the soil. And if we, in the same time series that was shown as gray, and gray is now shown in orange here. And the difference between this green line and this orange line suggests that a significant amount of that CO2 is dissolved into water. That's that reactivity. And that inorganic carbon makes its way to groundwater, which then can mobilize or weather out minerals in the base of the critical zone and has consequences for what ends up in the streams. And so we've noticed that in drought years and in wet years, these processes are different, suggesting that plants are critically responding to environmental drivers and transmitting that response deep into the critical zone. And so with that, I will summarize, and I apologize for having to skip so much, that this subsurface weathered bedrock layer that's actively undergoing weathering is impacted by plants, is impacted by water cycling. We have distinct observations of this zone, or we now have new capabilities to make these observations. It's very exciting and opening up a lot of new frontiers for us. And understanding this zone may be key to a lot of future challenges that we face in terms of understanding how Earth's past and future might be impacted by a higher CO2 atmosphere. Thank you. Thank you.
Should have stuck with Davies. So my name is Mo Walczak, and I am coming to you from Oregon State University. And I am going to pivot us away from the land towards the ocean. I gave Marissa a warning before the start of this seminar that I'm not really a geomorphologist. I'm more of a paleoceanographer who's geomorphology adjacent. But I'm going to try and make a case for why what we do should be interesting and fun for you too. So why care about the ocean? When this New Yorker cartoon came out, it was pretty eviscerating. I don't know why I don't care about the bottom of the ocean, but I don't, and that's pretty standard, but we really should. So I'm a Pacific paleoceanographer, and the Pacific is a substantial ocean basin. It's the largest ocean on Earth. It accounts for about 1/3 of Earth's surface, and because it's so deep, it accounts for about half of Earth's surface water. So the oceans collectively cover about 70% of Earth's surface. If you take a look at this map here, there is a perspective from space from which Earth looks just like the Pacific Ocean. So it's a pretty impressively large thing. Because water has a very high heat capacity, this also makes the Pacific the largest heat sink on Earth. Sort of a fun fact is that the oceans have been taking up most of the excess heat that's been delivered to our planet via global warming, anthropogenic climate change. The oceans are buffering about 80% of that. The Pacific Ocean absorbs the equivalent of several atomic bombs worth of energy every second, which is pretty impressive, and it's a wonderful thing that it does. And because of all the heat energy contained in this ocean basin, then changes in circulation of this ocean basin are responsible for the largest and most rapid reorganizations of heat on the planet. So on a time scale of months to decades, depending on the process, you can have changes in trade winds and upwelling that dramatically change how heat is distributed across this basin. And then that has wide-ranging implications for atmospheric heat circulation, as well as adjacent terrestrial ecosystems and climate systems. So I'm going to take you back in time now to study the Pleistocene Pacific. So the Pleistocene Pacific is very much like the modern Pacific, but it has a big ice sheet on it. Can you guys see my cursor? Is that something you can see? Yes, no? I hope you can see my cursor. So the ice sheet that was adjacent to the Pacific Ocean is called the Cordilleran. And the Cordilleran ice sheet at its maximum extent was about the size of modern day Greenland. And so as a result, there are maybe some lessons that we can learn about ice-ocean interactions, how ice sheets retreat, and the impacts of those ice sheet retreat events on adjacent oceanographic processes from studying this system. So similar to the late Pleistocene, when the Cordilleran ice sheet was at the edge of its stability, we are now in a situation where Greenland and perhaps West Antarctica are on the edge of their stability. So this animation here is going to show you what the Cordilleran ice sheet may have looked like. Unlike Greenland, obviously it's gone at its maximum extent. It extended from the Rocky Mountains all the way west to the Pacific Ocean. It was not just a static persistent thing. We know that it underwent periods of expansion and growth and retraction, similar to what we have seen from all the other ice sheets. This model here is showing what it may have looked like based on forcing from the Greenland climate record, GRIP, as well as from the Antarctic climate record. And they're a little bit different depending on which climate cycle this ice sheet was more sensitive to, whether the Antarctic Pacific influence was more important or the Northern Hemisphere Greenland influence was more representative. But one thing that you can see is that this ice sheet really waxes and wanes. So it surges out to maximum extent, and then it very quickly collapses back. And that's something that we see, again, in all ice sheet systems. But we're going to talk about these oscillations, these rapid retreat events. They're basically the point of this whole talk. So what are those oscillations, those millennial scale climate events? Depending on where you are, they have different names. So this graphic here is showing a compilation of data from Greenland and from Antarctica. To orient you on this axis here, this is time from the past to the present. So as you march across the page from the left to the right in the direction you read, you're moving from the distant past around 60,000 years ago into our modern climate on the far right. This top graphic here is showing the Greenland temperature record, the delta 18O record of Greenland. Basically, this is a byproduct of the fact that a heavier isotope of oxygen is harder to evaporate than a lighter isotope of oxygen. So in an ice core record where all the water has to get there via evaporation, it's always depleted relative to its 16O counterpart, but the extent to which it's depleted correlates to the climate at the time. So the colder it is, the more depleted it is, the less cold it is, or the warmer it is, the less picky evaporation is about picking it up. So these abrupt climate swings that you're seeing in Greenland here, there's many cycles happen on a few thousand-year scales. Those are called Dansgaard-Oeschger cycles, and each of these jumps from a low to a high, these abrupt warming, those are somewhere on the order of 5 to 10 degrees Celsius, depending on which one you're looking at. So these are pretty big, pretty abrupt climate oscillations. This warming is happening in a period of centuries. So this is the kind of scale of warming that we're seeing today in terms of its rate. We have a similar record for Antarctica down here. Delta 18O works the same way. So up is warm, down is cold. And you can see that there are also climate oscillations on the same time scale, perhaps less abrupt in Antarctica. And that those oscillations are actually kind of out of phase with Greenland. There's a reason for that called the bipolar seesaw. I'll talk about that briefly in a minute. The other thing I want to draw your attention to when looking at this graphic are these blue bars here. So these blue bars are called Heinrich events. Heinrich events actually aren't defined from the ice sheet record, they're defined from the adjacent marine record. So Heinrich events were first identified in the sediments of the North Atlantic. And what they are, they're periods where the sediments are very, very rich in ice-rafted debris. So ice-rafted debris is a word for large chunks of rock that get carried out into the deep, quiet ocean by icebergs. They can be much larger than the surrounding sediments because they're not being transported by governing current systems or downslope transport processes. They move into the quietest parts of the ocean, floating along happily with the icebergs. And then as the iceberg melts, those rocks drop out. They're really distinctive, and they're a really good indication that you have a marine terminating ice sheet, and that the peak abundance in ice-rafted debris tends to occur when a marine terminating ice sheet is pulling back. So a peak in IRD tends to mean that you have a large ice sheet that's retreating rapidly from its maximum extent. That's what we see in the modern record, and that's how we interpret the paleo record. So these Heinrich events occur recurrently through time, and they are reflecting retreat of the North Atlantic ice sheets. So the major contributor to them by mass is the Laurentide ice sheet, which is the ice sheet that extended from the Rockies east to the Atlantic Ocean. But there's also contributions in here from other European ice sheets, including the Fennoscandian ice sheet, the Iceland ice sheet. This is a period of pullback of all the Northern European ice. Another thing I want to note is that the follow-on from these is really distinct, right? After a Heinrich event, you get the largest warming events in the entire record, consistently. Prior to the Heinrich events, in terms of what causes them, there's nothing really consistent, right? Like this one's coming after a cooling period. This one's coming after a period of relative climate stability. You know, this one's coming after a period of relative climate warmth. So there's nothing really consistent in the temperature record that suggests to us why these ice sheets are pulling back. But nonetheless, we do have hypotheses. We always do. So one of the first and most enduring hypotheses is that the Heinrich events themselves are just a factor of the oscillation of the Laurentide ice sheet. So the ice sheet itself gets so big that it drives basal melting and starts to deform at its base, and then it basically sloops out along its margins, decreases in height, and then once it's at its reduced height with reduced mass, it restabilizes and then rebuilds back to that nice big fat size. Another possibility, which is almost as old as the discovery of the Heinrich events, is that it's being driven by failure of other ice sheets. The hypothesis that was postulated by Gerard Bond and Lottie back in 1995 was that the smaller ice sheets perhaps were more sensitive to some kind of climate perturbation or their own oscillation. They failed, and then they contributed a few meters to sea level rise. Not that much, these ice sheets are small, but that few meter sea level rise acted to destabilize the grounded outlet glaciers of the Laurentide, which then basically popped them like champagne corks. And once those grounded marine terminating ice outlets were off their moraines, then the ice sheet was oversteepened behind those and sort of squeezed out, again, reaching that lower elevation, more stable footprint, which then allowed the ice sheet to reground and rebuild again. The only new hypothesis that's really distinct from those two that's been explored in the last couple of decades is that it might have to do with an oceanographic forcing. So perhaps warming from the ocean is actually coming up and destroying those marine terminating outlet glaciers via subsurface heating. There is evidence that this is happening, and it's some kind of intermediary role. But these are really the three big explanations for what's going on. One thing that is known is that even though the Heinrich events are certainly identified as a North Atlantic process, they do have a global footprint. So this is a graphic from a paper by Sid Hemming in 2003 that kind of shows a periodicity of climate oscillations spanning the planet from Greenland. So this is the NGRIP record. This is actually a marine Heinrich event record shown in percent carbonate from 609. That carbonate's coming from North America. Versus some low latitude Atlantic records. And then this over here, this is a Hulu record, a speleothem all the way over in China. And what it shows is that during the Heinrich events, you actually have a strong change in the isotopic signature of the speleothem, stable isotope ratios over in China, which they associate with changes in monsoon strength, actually weakening in the East Asian monsoon. So that would suggest that these climate changes in the North Atlantic have really wide-reaching effects. They are, in fact, acting to perturb global climate. And so there's been a lot of attention into understanding what's happening here. While it's long been established, again, that there is a Pacific climate periodicity that seems to be coeval with the Heinrich events, there's not really been much thought that the Pacific is an important driver. There is no deep water formation in the Pacific like you get in the Atlantic. The surface Pacific is just too fresh. So in the high latitude North Pacific, we don't get deep water formation. Instead, we get ventilation of some of the oldest bottom waters on Earth. It's known to be an important part of the carbon cycle, but it hasn't really been explored as an important driver of global climate change. However, we had an opportunity to re-examine some of these assumptions via collection of new drill core records from the Gulf of Alaska back in 2013. So this is a riserless drilling platform called the Joydes Resolution. She's operated by the International Ocean Discovery Program. This program has existed in some form or another since the 1960s. It's one of the largest scientific collaborations on Earth with dozens of member nations. And several times a year, a half dozen times a year, this ship sails out to a location that's been identified by consensus of all its member nations to be an important one for global science. And then they drill really, really long sediment records. They don't necessarily have to be sediment records. This is also the program via which we've done things like sample the mantle. But in the case of the Joydes is really specialized for getting soft overlying sediment records. And that's what we are gonna look at here, the sediment records that were collected on the Gulf of Alaska margin. So the site that I'm gonna focus on for the rest of this talk was collected right up in the armpit of Alaska on the continental slope. That location is pretty important for this work. You don't want to be on the continental shelf because at LGM, the continental shelf was occupied by ice, right? It was subaerial or close to it. And then out in the abyssal plain, because, well, there's two things. One is you get downslope transport processes that complicate those records, but the other is that the deep Pacific has a lot of carbon and it's very corrosive. So we really can't spend a lot of time trying to get forams out there, other proxies. They're difficult to date, difficult to get paleotemperature reconstructions, et cetera. But the slope is kind of the sweet spot. We have good preservation of our proxies, and we have nice continuous sediment accumulation. So I'm now going to pivot to records that are collected from foraminifera. Foraminifera are amoeboid protists. They have a shell that's made out of calcium carbonate. We can radiocarbon date that shell. We can also measure a variety of other temperature proxies in it and climate proxies, including stable isotopes, stable carbon isotopes, stable oxygen isotopes. I'm going to be talking predominantly about the radiocarbon record contained in the planktic and the benthic. So these are seafloor dwelling foraminifera on this margin. So this is what the radiocarbon record looks like in time calibrated for these cores. This is 0 to 90 meters, and in 90 meters, we have about 50,000 years of sediment accumulation. The blue dots are the surface dwelling foraminifera, the red dots are the benthic foraminifera. We can talk about how we handle the calibration of this later if there's any interest. But for now, just trust me, this is a very, very refined product with hundreds of dates that went into it. And we have this wonderful age model that shows that during the Pleistocene, so this transition here where the sed rates fall off, this is where there's a small change in depth versus age. This is where the great ice sheets disappeared. And then prior to this, we had very high sed rates. That's where the glacial buzzsaw in the Gulf of Alaska is super active. So another thing that we can get from those radiocarbon dates is we can actually look at the differences between the benthic and the planktic radiocarbon. And those differences actually track changes in ocean circulation because radiocarbon is produced almost exclusively in the atmosphere. So the benthic radiocarbon is always going to be older than the surface radiocarbon, and the extent to which it's older is going to be tracking circulation processes that mix radiocarbon into and through the ocean. And so what we see here, this is time from 0 to 45,000 years ago. We're only going to look at that part of the record because the errors, the uncertainties on the dates back here make it difficult to interpret beyond that. We can see that there are these systematic oscillations in the radiocarbon age differences that are going to be reflecting ocean circulation. The other thing that's really interesting is that these peaks where these really high ventilation events occur, where the bottom waters get very old, those are coincident with periods of peak IRD delivery to the Pacific. So we're going to call these CQ events. That's the local Inuit word for ice. So these CQ events here occur with approximately the same periodicity as the Heinrich events, and they're showing evidence for a strong coupling between ocean circulation processes and ice sheet retreat. But punchline, they're not actually at the same time as the Heinrich events. So this is going back, showing that familiar NGRIP temperature record. The location of the Heinrich events are shown in bars as these tan bars here. They're numbered H0 through H4. This orange line here is showing the IRD record from the North Atlantic on an independent radiocarbon-based chronology, highlighting where these big Heinrich events are. H3 is kind of weird. We won't have time to get into that. But for these big Heinrich events, we have a correlating CQ event in the Pacific. And in every single case, the big CQ events precede the big Heinrich events by over 1,000 years. So that gives us something important, right? This is suggesting to us that the Pacific events are not in fact a downstream response to the Heinrich events, but actually some earlier, more dynamic part of the climate system. Maybe they're responding to the same external forcer and the Cordilleran's responding faster because it's a smaller ice sheet, but we can't invoke a response to the North Atlantic sensu stricto as a driver for these episodes of Cordilleran retreat. Another thing I want to draw to your attention, and this is important, is that the shutdown in deep water formation in the Atlantic that is modeled to accompany these Heinrich events from the input of freshwater, that should drive intermediate waters in the Pacific younger. The CQ events actually show that prior to the Heinrich events, the ventilation ages get older. During the Heinrich events, they do actually get younger, as you would expect as a from a response. But prior to the Heinrich events, this is a different kind of beast. We do have a CQ event 0 shown here in the radiocarbon record. We don't see that in the IRD record, but I understand from colleagues working on the ground in Alaska that this is actually likely to be a period of terrestrial evidence for ice sheet retreat. The ice sheet just wasn't marine terminating, so we don't get the IRD out. This is showing that radiocarbon ventilation record relative to the Hulu record of Speleothem Delta 18O, showing the same basic thing, that during the Heinrich events, you see exactly what you would expect, younging, intermediate waters, weakened Asian monsoon, but prior to the Heinrich events, over 1,000 years prior, for many of them, you see a strengthening of monsoon and a change in Pacific Ocean circulation. So I stacked the 3 events for which we had complete records together to kind of pull together a total climate process here, and this is what falls out of that stack. That early, so the peak in the IRD records are lined up on 3,000 years, and then everything else just falls forward and back from that. And this is time marching from 0 through 7,000 years, again, where the peak IRD is lined up at 3,000 and everything else just falls out. And what we see is that early in these millennial scale climate oscillations, we have strong Asian monsoon and a warming North Pacific. that quickly correlates to changes in Pacific Ocean circulation and retreat of the Cordilleran ice sheet. This is the IRD record and the delta. Oh, sorry, hold on one second here. And so this is happening in the Cordilleran, reflecting changing ocean circulation and changing IRD delivery. Shortly after that, we start to see evidence for Antarctic warming and global CO2 rise. And then this is where the Heinrich events happen, where the Laurentide pulls back. And then after the Laurentide pulls back, we see the response to the Heinrich event that everybody has known about for a long time. So we see the warming in the Atlantic, we see the younging of the intermediate waters in the Pacific, and we see the weakening of Asian monsoon. So this kind of turns on its head what we thought we knew about how these climate systems unfold. What drives millennial scale climate change? We still don't know. But the evidence is supporting that there's actually a dynamic two-way connection between these abrupt events in the Pacific and the Atlantic. We can't really describe the Atlantic as being the sole driver sensu stricto. The timing kind of rules that out. It's a chicken and egg problem. It's possible changes in Pacific Ocean circulation destabilized North Hemisphere ice sheets. It's also possible that they were destabilized by something else which changed ocean circulation. We don't know at this time. And so hopefully as we continue to work on these records, we'll get more information and be able to start teasing those phase relationships apart.
Can everybody see my presentation? And I should have closed captions on. Okay, thank you, Marissa, and thank you, Mo. I'm in good company because I'm also not a geomorphologist. So I'm taking everybody on a paleoecology detour back to the land. I'll be talking about paleoecological insights into drivers of landscape change in Dhofar, Oman, particularly focused on the vegetation. And so I am a third-year PhD student at Penn State University. So I just want to thank my advisor and my collaborators at Ohio State University to start. Okay, so as we all know, anthropogenic climate change is accelerating, and a lot of regions on Earth are going to enter or are predicted to enter novel climate spaces. So climate spaces that don't exist anywhere else on Earth today by the end of the century. And a lot of these ecosystems are drylands, which comprise about like 40% of the Earth's land surface and support over a third of the Earth's population. And these ecosystems are sensitive to changes in temperature and precipitation. So it's important to reconstruct longer term records to understand how different mechanisms of vegetation change operate. And so we can use the paleoecological as well as some archaeological data, which I'll get to later, to investigate this in the past as an analog for the future. So I'll be taking you to Dhofar, Oman. This is a great setting for this type of study because it's hyper arid and also home to really biodiverse vegetation. And so to talk a little bit more about the Dhofar region specifically, there are 4 distinct ecological zones which are characterized by changes in topography as well as vegetation. So in yellow, the coastal plain is very sparsely vegetated, and there's a lot of human disturbance. The escarpment is in the Dhofar Mountains. This is home to a seasonal cloud forest oases where the northernmost extent of the Indian monsoon brings dense fog and allows a rather desiccated ecosystem to become this lush looking thing that you see in the bottom left during the summer months. The plateau in blue is a grassland, and furthest inland is the Nejd Desert. You can see it's a very different landscape than what you see on the bottom photo. It's sparsely vegetated, isolated trees and shrubs. And this is where the samples for this project are collected from, as shown on the inset on the map. So a good time to investigate changes in precipitation and their effect on vegetation is the mid-Holocene. So we're at the termination of the Holocene humid period, which was a time of increased precipitation. And so this terminates, whether abruptly or gradually is debated, but I'm going to focus on a Speleothem deltatino record presented by Flightman et al. And this was developed from a cave in Dhofar. And so you can see that there's a gradual enrichment trend. These axes are inverted starting around 7,000 or 8,000 years ago. And so you are seeing gradual decreasing precipitation that's associated with a southward migration of the intertropical convergence zone and a weakening of the Indian monsoon. So this raises 2 broad research questions that drive my PhD project. So how did vegetation communities change through time? And also, how did local paleohydrological conditions change? So this is a record of regional precipitation, but may not necessarily reflect what's going on with local hydrology. This was not an empty, barren landscape. People have lived here and still live here, and they practice nomadic pastoralism, which is the herding of domesticated animals such as cows, camels, and goats. And this has been practiced in this region for at least the last 7,000 years. And so from the archaeological record, we know that there were periods of high mobility where people are not building permanent dwelling structures. They're moving throughout the Nejd, and we know this because they built monuments. So that looks like a pile of rocks, but that is in fact one of the monuments that they built. And this contrasts with a period of settlement around 2,300 years ago that starts around 2,300 years ago. And you can see the outlines of foundations of more permanent habitation sites that were built on the plateau, so closer to the coast. And we know from regional records that this was a much drier time. And so this may indicate a scarcity of resources, so people are congregating closer to more water and vegetation resources. And so obviously these are two different modes of living, two different mobility states. And so I want to know, what role did humans play in shaping the landscape, because both of these kind of changes in mobility are going to have different implications for the vegetation. And so we're in a very arid place, so you don't have traditional paleoclimate archives like lakes. So what do? And the answer lies with these little critters here. I'm assuming you can see my cursor. They are rock hyraxes, and they may look like groundhogs, but they are not in fact rodents. Their closest living relative is the elephant. Thank you, Marissa, for your thumbs up. And so they use communal latrines that are separate from their dens, and these accumulate as layered deposits of harassium, a crystallized urinary product, and fecal pellets that preserve paleoenvironmental indicators for thousands of years. And so if you're sitting there thinking to yourself, wow, her science is so glamorous and I'm so jealous, you know, I can't say I blame you. So the first proxy that I'll be using to investigate this first question, how do vegetation communities change through time, is pollen. Pollen is diagnostic of different plant taxa. So for example, the pollen grain on the right is Boswellia sacra, otherwise known as frankincense, which is endemic to the region. And the pollen on the left is Terminalia dopharica. And so I want you to pay close attention to this character, because this is one of our cloud forest trees, and it's specially adapted to intercept fog and increase net precipitation significantly. So it's a really key aspect of the ecohydrology of that ecosystem. Okay, so to summarize the pollen results, I'm just going to present a detrended correspondence analysis. So you're seeing samples that are shown by the symbols. They're clustering together with samples of similar composition and clustering near taxonomic names of the plants that characterize those compositions. And what you see is basically a gradient of time across DCA axis 1, and so taxonomic turnover through time. Our grouping here over on the right side of DCA axis 1 is our modern and submodern samples. They're grouping with plants such as this tree here, Salvadora persica, otherwise known as the toothbrush tree, because people have traditionally used their roots for toothbrushes. And this is a very characteristic tree of the Nejd today, as well as cassia and dodonia. So these are plants that are disturbance indicators. And what that means is that they're not very tasty to our camel and cow friends. And so where there's areas of high grazing, you'll find plants like these in the highest abundance. This contrasts with the group on the left side of DCA axis 1, which comprises our older samples. And so these are grouping with plant names such as Combertaceae, which mainly consists of Terminalia dopharica. That's the only member of Combertaceae in Dhofar today. Our cloud forest tree, which, like I said, does not exist in the Nejd Desert today, as well as trees like Matinus. This also has more music affiliations. It's found in wetter environments in the region. And so this loud, confusing diagram I'm going to break down, but essentially I have the Flightman Speleothem Delta 18O record plotted on the bottom there, and then the samples are plotted by their ages across the x-axis. The y-axes relate to either pollen abundances or microcharcoal concentration, or the bottom, Delta 18O and per mil. And what I did was I took groups of plants such as more mesic affiliated taxa, disturbance indicators, and summed the pollen from all of these groups in each sample, so we could look at broad trends in these groups through time in our record. And so we have also at the top, I've indicated periods of different monument construction in the archaeological record, that period of plateau settlement, and the introduction of camel herding. And so I said earlier that plateau settlement occurs during this kind of more arid time. We have a gap in our midden record as well as a gap in the Speleothem record. So there's enforcing this idea that it's much drier, there's no Speleothem growth, and both people and hyraxes seem to have moved out of this region, indicating resources may have been much more scarce at this time. So to start with our mesic taxa, so again, those trees that I presented earlier, among others, you see they're much more abundant in the older samples and then decrease later on in the record. And I want to highlight this 31.2% abundance of Combretaceae pollen. This is important because this is an insect pollinated plant. So typically, if you're finding this large of an abundance of pollen, it's indicating a local presence of that tree. So really, it was just dumping pollen into this midden, which is a really interesting finding because, again, they exist very far away on the escarpment today. And it was living out in the nedged around 3,000 years ago. The nedged association, so these are plants that are commonly found in the nedge today, like our toothbrush tree or these small shrubs here, which are like acacia trees or Senegalia. The names recently changed. They're always changing on us. And you can see that these increase in abundance again later on in the record, especially around 1,000 years ago. And to speak a little bit about people and what we can determine from this pollen record, we see our disturbance indicators increase also significantly around 1,000 years ago, along with Spormiella shown in the gray bars in that bottom panel. And Spormiella is a dung fungus that occurs in large herbivore feces, so it doesn't occur in hyrax poop because otherwise we'd be seeing it off the charts, but it occurs in camel dung in this region. And so that also increases significantly around 500 years ago. And it's important to think about this today because the region is impacted by really severe overgrazing. So that picture on the top shows a fence that on the right there's camels and on the left there's no camels. And so obviously they have a pretty large impact on the vegetation today. There was a lot of economic growth over the last century that led to really high stocking rates of these animals. But I also think it's important to note the long-term sustainability of pastoralism. So the increase in disturbance indicators and Spormiella are occurring 1,000 to 1,500 years after the introduction of camels. And pastoralism had persisted as a practice in this region for 7,000 years. So this is also important to consider when we're thinking about sustainability initiatives. So we're not imposing a Western framework of sustainability where it's not necessarily culturally relevant or needed. Anyway, I digress. Also, the microcharcoal shown in the black line is peaking at the time where we have this higher abundance of mesic taxa. So there's more trees on the landscape, there's trees that are associated with wetter environments, and this large spike in microcharcoal is suggesting that there's also more vegetation cover, more continuous vegetation cover than we'd see on the landscape today. There's more fuel for wildfires, natural wildfires. So you get this picture of a wetter our boreal community that has more continuous vegetation, contrasting with the turnover to what you would see in that picture today, more sparse and drier affiliated taxa. Lastly, to chat a little bit about that Speleothem record. So we're already at the tail end of this. It's continuing, rainfall is continuing to decrease, but we're already 3,000 to 4,000 years after the onset of precipitation when we see the presence of these mesic trees and specifically Terminalia. So this leads to the hypothesis that the range of these taxa was much more extensive in the earlier part of the Holocene under more intense monsoon conditions and higher rainfall, and that this contracted over time as precipitation decreased. But I want to investigate this further, right? So we have this hypothesis, and how do we test it? We have bulk nitrogen isotopes from the middens that suggests that moisture availability was decreasing locally, and I can further constrain this by extracting leaf wax and alkanes from the middens, which I've already successfully done, and then conduct compound-specific stable isotope analyses. So for hydrogen and carbon isotopes. Hydrogen isotopes, the compound-specific hydrogen isotopes, are related to local hydrological conditions, and the carbon relates to C3 and C4 photosynthetic pathways. So this is starting to build up this link between local paleohydrological changes and changes in vegetation. And so that's what I'm working on now. And to just tease a little bit about what I'll be doing going forward, we have a team that we work with. So we're an interdisciplinary team with anthropologists and modelers at Ohio State University, and they've built an agent-based model based on contemporary pastoralism in the region, the output of which is changes in vegetation patches. So we have pastoralist camps and different, kinds of animals moving across the landscape and different climate parameters that we can adjust. And the model will run for a period of so many years. And then you will see how that mosaic of vegetation patches changes through time. And so this will allow us to run some kind of interesting simulations where we use paleoclimate and paleoecological data to guide our climate parameter, input parameters, precipitation parameters, as well as different browsing pressures based on the archaeological record. So I'm going to run these simulations to try to start to disentangle, the different mechanisms of vegetation change, both climate and people in this region, and then compare that to the empirical data that I've generated. And so obviously this isn't, a direct one-to-one correlation, but it is a really powerful and interesting tool to start to address these questions. And with that, I just want to say thank you again to my advisor, my committee members, the Assam project team, colleagues, wonderful colleagues in Oman, as well as the National Science Foundation for supporting this project. I have my contact info up there, and I believe there should be plenty of time for questions.
All right. So I'd like to first thank IAG for putting this webinar together and for inviting such a great collection of speakers to come together and have a really nice day talking about science. So today, and then I should also mention I'd like to thank my funding sources, which is the NSF and Colorado State University, for the work I'm about to present. So I'm Sean Gallen, an assistant professor from Colorado State University. My research is largely focused in tectonic geomorphology. And so I'm going to be sort of shifting focus from a lot of the geomorphic emphases today. And I'm going to demonstrate how we can use geomorphic measurements to illuminate subduction zone geodynamics and orogenesis through a case study of a subduction zone in southern Italy, where my co-authors and I have used tectonic geomorphology measurements to recover a 30 million year history of rock uplift. So if you are a geologist, you learn in Intro to Geology that subduction zone mountain building, or orogenesis, is a product of crustal, mantle, and surface processes. And there's a bunch of modeling studies and conceptual arguments and measurements that have been made out in the field to demonstrate that this is the case. What remains challenging is deconvolving the relative contributions to each of these different processes to orogenesis and topographic growth and decay over time in natural settings. And so that's what I'm going to be trying to do today. But we do have a pretty good conceptual understanding of how different tectonic and geodynamic forces might shape orogenesis and build topography. From a simple crustal view, we often think of mountain building or decay in convergent margins as the result of changes in a source term, shown in this little schematic diagram here, which we often refer to as the accretionary flux, which can be approximated as the thickness of the incoming sediment multiplied by the convergence velocity. And what's nice about this framework is it allows us to make simple predictions that if we have changes in that source term, for example, if all else is equal, we change the convergence velocity by speeding it up, we'd expect the origin to grow. If that source term shrinks by having subduction velocity or convergence velocity slow, we'd expect the origin to decay. However, we also know that it's not just a simple crustal process in subduction zones, that slabs in the mantle play an important role in determining the elevation of mountains above subduction zones. This is a nice example of that from Taylor Schildgen and others, where they make the argument that tearing of the Cyprian and Hellenic slabs and associated mantle flow resulted in recent uplift of the northern Anatolian plateau. So this is another mechanism or series of mechanisms that we need to consider when we're looking at subduction zone mountain building. So what I want to do today is try to better understand these different drivers, these different tectonic and geodynamic drivers of orogenesis in a given subduction zone, and see how they might change over the lifetime of subduction. And in order to do this, my co-authors and I thought that it would be a good idea to compare long-term continuous histories of rock uplift and topographic change to known histories of subduction over long timescales. And I'll get into this later, but this isn't the easiest thing to do. We selected a case study in southern Italy. So we're working in the Calabrian subduction forearc, which is highlighted here as the toe of the boot in Italy. The reason why we picked this subduction zone is that it's a classic example of a retreating subduction system, meaning that it's mobile, and it has a really well-constrained history of retreat since it rifted off of Iberia in the Eocene to Oligocene and then has migrated across the central Mediterranean to its current position here. So this is the reconstructed subduction retreat rate through time. And what's nice about this is that it has order of magnitude variations in subduction speed through time. So this provides a really nice natural experiment to see how the origin in the upper plate is changing through time. How is mountain building adjusting to these order of magnitude changes in retreat velocity? And we can simplify this retreat velocity as a four-stage retreat history of fast, slow retreat. The other thing that's nice about this subduction system is that we have a lot of context for what's driving these changes in subduction speed that gives us more interpretive power when we produce our results. So this is a schematic showing the descending slab through time in 4 different time slices. And what we know from these types of reconstructions is that the initial fast phase of retreat, that's about 40 millimeters per year, is occurring when the slab is descending through the upper mantle. And then at about 16 million years ago, when the slab hits the base of the upper mantle, that represents a viscosity discontinuity at about 660 kilometers depth, it slows. The reason why it slows is that the slab needs to accommodate its geometry in order for the upper plate to start to retreat again. So it has to drape over that 660 discontinuity, and then it can move really fast again. And this time it picks up speed to about 50 millimeters per year. And then at about 1 to 2 million years ago, that subduction speed stopped, and that's thought to be associated with tearing of the subduction slab and small scale plate reorganizations. So we'll leverage this to our benefit later when we're interpreting the results. What's nice about this known history is that we can make predictions about what we think the uplift history on in the upper plate of the subduction zone might be through time if we make specific assumptions. For example, if we assume that orogenesis in this system is predominantly a crustal process, we would make the assumption that anytime we have fast uplift rates, it's associated with fast subduction, and anytime it slows, it's associated with slow subduction. So we'd have like a positive correlation between the subduction retreat rate and the rock uplift rate that we might recover. And so what we're going to do is generate a 30 million year history of rock uplift for the Calabrian forearc and compare it to our prediction that we have here. We're basically going to populate this diagram with real data. Now, this isn't an easy task. So what we're going to do is basically throw the kitchen sink at the problem and try to generate the highest resolution, most continuous rock uplift history for the forearc that we can by leveraging a bunch of different measurements that we commonly make in tectonic geomorphology. So the first and perhaps most obvious data set that we're going to use here is the landscape itself, or the topography itself. And what's nice about southern Italy is that it has what we refer to as relic topography. This is high elevation, low relief topography that records the past history of rock uplift before there was a change in the rate of rock uplift. And so the landscape itself is telling us that there's been a change in the rate of rock uplift, and we can use it to be able to quantify the magnitude of the change and when that change occurred. We're also going to use a series of analytical data sets. In this case, we're going to use existing cosmogenic beryllium-10 basin average erosion rates that are recording erosion rates average over centennial to millennial timescales. And we're going to use this to better understand rates of rock uplift over short timescales and calibrate surface process models that we're going to use to generate these long-term rock uplift histories. To go farther back in time, we have generated new and compiled existing low temperature thermochronology data sets in the form of apatite, uranium, thorium, helium, and apatite fission track. And these measurements are going to record mineral cooling in the upper few kilometers of the Earth's surface, and they allow us to extend our history of rock uplift farther back in time than we can do with the landscape alone. We're focusing in on 3 different locations in the forearc. In the north, Sila, in the middle, Lacera, and in the south, Aspromonte. And these are the 3 main crustal blocks or massifs in the forearc. And we're going to recover independent rock uplift histories for each of these locations at the moderate catchment scale. The reason why we're looking at that spatial scale is that it's relatively small, so we can make some simplifying assumptions that the spatial distribution of rock uplift is relatively uniform, and we can just solve for the temporal history of rock uplift at these 3 different sites. And then it also helps us ensure that we're meeting some of the assumptions necessary for the models that we're going to be using, for example, that these are predominantly bedrock rivers. Now, I don't have time to go into the details of all the modeling, but basically what we're doing is we're getting all of those different data sets to generate a long-term continuous rock uplift history. We're using a series of different forward models that predict that data. And then we're going to use a data-driven Bayesian inversion scheme to recover the uplift histories and resolve the parameters of interest. But the basics of how this model works is that we give it an input rock uplift history, and then we evolve the topography and predict erosion with a simple stream power model. The erosion history that's output from that is used to drive thermal and kinetic models that predict the thermochronologic data. And they are also used to drive production and attenuation models for the cosmogenic nuclides to predict that data. We then compare the modeled and predicted data via misfit function, and then use the Bayesian optimization scheme to do an optimized parameter search to determine the acceptable range of solutions within our given parameter space. The first thing that we do is we empirically calibrate the stream power model based on the existing beryllium-10 data and topographic data. There's nothing too exciting about that, except that we find that the system needs to be modeled in a nonlinear framework based on that calibration. The reason why we do this is that it makes for more direct comparisons for the uplift histories from each of the different catchments that we're considering, and it reduces the parameter space, making the inversion more efficient. In the end, we end up solving for 3- and 4-stage uplift histories and initial geothermal gradient that result in different numbers of free parameters, but ultimately result in very similar outcomes. And if you want to know more of the details of the inverse modeling approach, you can see Christoph Glossbach's nice paper in geology that was published in 2015. So first I'll show you the results, and then we'll actually, or the data fits, and then we'll actually get into the results. So here are the fits to each of the different catchments. What I can say is that generally the fits are good. We predict for our river profiles and our river networks, we predict nick points at approximately the right location, and then average misfits on the river profiles are on the order of several tens of meters, so this is pretty good. The analytical data are shown by these bivariate plots with these dots, and the model fits are shown there. And the analytical data is quite noisy, but we do fit the data sufficiently. And this suggests with our relatively simple forward models that we're able to predict the data pretty well, which is an exciting outcome for us, because this is a really simple set of forward models that we're using. I'll note that the data fits do not improve with a 4-stage uplift history. And the 4-stage uplift history is basically indistinguishable from a 3-stage uplift history, suggesting that 3-stage uplift history is adequate in explaining the data sets that we have. And so that's what I'll be presenting from here on out. We're going to be looking at a lot of plots that look like this moving forward. So I'll describe them. On the x-axis, we have the prior range. This is the range in the parameter space that we allow the inverse model to search when trying to populate what we call the posterior distribution, which is highlighted here by this kernel density plot, or it's basically a histogram of the acceptable solutions and shows you the distribution of the acceptable parameter space. And then this pink line and these pink numbers are the best fit models. So overall, we have a relatively well-constrained posterior distribution. The resolution farther back in model time is worse, and this is because the data sets that we're using are noisier and we have fewer data points. And then you'll see that resolution increases as we move forward in model time. So this is the initial rock uplift rate in the model, and the important thing to pull out of this is that the rock uplift rates are relatively fast, greater than 0.5 millimeter and typically around 1 millimeter per year. Then in the middle Miocene, the rock uplift rates slow by at least, they drop by about a minimum of a quarter and sometimes up to an order of magnitude. And then at about 1 to 1.5 million years ago, the rock uplift rates increased to about 2/3 of a millimeter per year. So the things to pull out of this are that, and then the other thing is that we solve for the initial geothermal gradient, but it turns out that the model is not very sensitive to this. So what we find is that the initial geothermal gradient and the early rock uplift history are not as well resolved as other parts of the history. And this is because it's largely reliant on the fission track data, which is really noisy in this setting. And then as our data sets improve in quality, we get better model resolution. The modern rock uplift rates that we find are consistent with independent estimates of coastal rock uplift from marine terraces, and the range of which are highlighted by these bars here, giving us confidence that we're at least resolving something real in the modern. This is what the rock uplift rate histories look like for these 3 different catchments, and it can be described in general as a fast, slow, fast history that we can now compare to that retreat history or that subduction history, which is shown down here below, which, to refresh your memory, is fast, slow, fast, slow. So we can go back to our little model that we had predicted if we had a crustal, if we had an origin dominated by crustal dynamics, and our predicted history looks something like this. And if we compare that to the not observed history, but the recovered history, what we find is that we have a period from 30 to 10 MA, where we have effectively a positive correlation between rock uplift rates and subduction retreat rates, suggesting that the system, orogenesis in the system, was dominated by crustal thickening. Then from 10 MA to present, we have an anti-correlation between the subduction velocity and rock uplift. Basically at 10 MA, the subduction velocity accelerates, the forearc does not respond. And then when subduction velocity slows by about an order of magnitude, the rock uplift rate in the forearc increases. So this is a really weird finding. And so we want to look at this in a little bit more detail. We'll start towards the present and move our way backward because we know more about what's happening in the modern state than in the past. So this recent rock uplift rate increase that's highlighted here in the plot below is consistent with interpretations for recent tearing of the Calabrian slab to the north and the south of the modern day forearc that happened about 1 to 2 million years ago, and is thought to have changed isostatic equilibrium and allowed for toroidal flow of mantle material around the torn slab edges. And this is thought to generate uplift of the forearc in recent times. And our results are entirely consistent with this, where we predict that we have the highest uplift rates in the north and the south that initiate earlier than accelerated rock uplift in the center of the forearc. So we think that this provides a good explanation for the rock uplift histories from 2MA to present. If we go back to this period where we basically have really fast convergence rates, but really low rock uplift rates, this is a little bit of a conundrum. This is a little bit puzzling, but I'm going to forward an interpretation that I hope isn't terrible. So if we look back at those reconstructions of where the slab was, what we can begin to think through are what might be changing boundary conditions in the mantle that might result in a change in the state of orogenesis going from one dominated by crustal dynamics to one that's dominated by mantle dynamics. And the major change that occurs is at about 16 to 10 MA when the subducting slab encounters the 660 discontinuity in the mantle. And we argue that this established a new set of boundary conditions that resulted in vigorous upper mantle flow and strong negative buoyancy beneath the forearc that effectively shut off isostasy so that the forearc couldn't respond in a normal way to accelerated crustal thickening. Basically, it's not able to accelerate, it's not able to produce higher topographic elevations because of the negative dynamic topography. And then it wasn't until about 1 to 2 million years ago when the slab tore apart and fragmented that condition was disrupted and the forearc was able to rise up rapidly above sea level. So the conclusions that I have are that the data-driven inversion of tectonic geomorphology measurements can reveal long-term rock uplift histories in subduction forearcs or other locations as well. The uplift history in Calabria doesn't appear to be directly related to the subduction retreat history for the past 10 MA, suggesting that it's dominated by mantle dynamics in some way. This implies that slab-mantle interactions are really critical for understanding orogenesis, rock uplift, and topographic change in many subduction forearcs. We argue that the recent acceleration in rock uplift is an expected response to slab fragmentation and mantle flow. So this isn't an anomaly, but the slow Miocene to Quaternary forearc uplift in the context of rapid convergence stands out as enigmatic, and we need to explore that more from a geodynamic perspective to better understand why that's occurring in the setting. So I don't know if there's time for questions, but I'd be happy to take any. Thank you.